Chapter 733. Xiaoxian's body was surrounded by fluctuations of power. The people in the forging room could feel it, but they didn't understand why Xiaoxian was doing this. Moreover, it wasn't the fluctuation of totem power. The people in the forging room were at a loss. They couldn't understand, but they didn't look away. They wanted to know what the great elder wanted to do with the knife, and why he dripped blood on it. As Xiaoxian's thumb moved, a long line of blood that wasn't too deep was left on the knife. But even if the blood wasn't deep, it still shocked the people who saw it. This shouldn't be. According to the strength of Xiaoxian's fingers, there shouldn't have been such a blood mark when he rubbed the knife. For example, when a few people were fighting over the knife, someone's hand was cut and blood dripped onto the knife. If he didn't use his clothes to wipe the blood off the knife, he could have wiped it off with his fingers. Even if he couldn't wipe it off, it wouldn't have left much of a mark. It wouldn't have been like the blood that Xiaoxian left on the knife just now. Where Xiaoxian's finger had touched, there was a blood mark that defied common sense. It was as if the drop of blood was no longer the liquid they were familiar with, but had become extremely sticky, like cooked grains. Only when one's finger pressed on it and slid over it would leave such a mark. But that was blood, not grains. It was too strange. The blood mark was only one of the reasons. What happened next shocked them even more. They saw Xiaoxian standing there. After wiping the blood on the knife to create a blood mark, he slapped his palm on the knife, right at the end of the blood mark. Whoosh! Flames appeared on Xiaoxian's palm. Almost at the same time, the flames spread along the blood mark and burned. Burn! It burned! It burned! Everyone who saw this stared with their eyes wide open. There was no wood, no charcoal, but the knife suddenly burned. No, it wasn't an ordinary flame. The people in the forging room reacted quickly. They were very sensitive to fire. Whether it was an ordinary fire, or a fire related to the fire seed, even totem warriors could tell, let alone them. But it was also because of this that they were even more surprised. It was the power of the fire seed. That's right, it was different from the primordial fire seed. It was similar to the power of the fire seed that had fused with their bodies, but it also had the aura and deterrence of the fire seed itself. But even if it was related to the fire seed, it shouldn't be able to ignite on a saber. How did the great elder do it? Sure enough, Xiaoxian whispered as he looked at the flames on his saber. The thought that flashed through his mind was when he was exploring the flaming river with his fleet. He saw the drumming tribesmen fighting against the fearsome beasts at the drumming tribe. At that time, the drumming tribe's net entangled the beast. Moreover, the net on top of the beast was all set ablaze. Later, Xiaoxian also tried it. At that time, Xiaoxian was immersed in a very mysterious state. It was as if he knew what to do and what the results would be. At that time, Xiaoxian used the same method to tie the beast's neck, but when Xiaoxian tried it again, he didn't succeed. First, he didn't understand the power at that time. He wasn't familiar with it, and the environment was different. Because of the drumming tribe's fire seed, they created a special kind of battlefield. It was filled with invisible forces that were more suitable for the drumming tribe to fight in. Without those conditions, it wouldn't be easy for Xiaoxian to succeed again. Second, and most importantly, Xiaoxian tried almost all the new bronze weapons. Xiaoxian remembered that when he tried to use his blood to ignite the new bronze weapon, he couldn't concentrate. It was as if there was a lot of resistance. Now, after comparing the new bronze weapon and the sword in his hand, Xiaoxian knew the difference between the two. It wasn't just the new bronze. The sword that Gong Jiaheng made for him had something else added as well. That was why, compared to the sword in his hand, it wasn't pure enough for Xiaoxian to succeed in igniting it. There were too many disturbances. Perhaps in the future, when Xiaoxian was truly familiar with the technique and could control it well enough to ignore the disturbances, he might be able to ignite it. However, for now, Xiaoxian had only succeeded in igniting it on tools other than the worm silk. After understanding the reason, Xiaoxian smiled. He retracted the energy supporting the flames on the sword. The flames that were burning along the bloodstains suddenly extinguished. The sword was still the same sword. There were no obvious changes. It was as if the flames didn't exist. However, the bloodstains on the sword were much lighter. Xiao Xian touched the sword and chopped a few more pieces of wood. He didn't notice any substantial changes. Only then did he relax. Perhaps it was because he ignited too little blood, and the flames burned for too short a time. Or perhaps the sword's material was better at withstanding the flames. Either way, he couldn't see any obvious changes in the sword. After all, the nets and threads that were burned in the drumming tribe had all turned to ash. Xiao Xian couldn't help but think. He would have to be more careful when he tried to ignite the flames with his blood. He didn't want the sword to change. Xiao Xian left satisfied, leaving the people in the forging room standing there in confusion. The sword had been forged. This proved that the crystal heart could forge weapons that were as good as the new bronze weapon. This was encouraging, but Xiao Xian still had a question. He took an animal skin scroll to the Flaming River trading point to look for EC. EC was surprised to see Xiao Xian. However, when he saw what Xiao Xian wrote on the animal skin scroll, EC temporarily put aside his business and closed the shop. "You wrote this?" EC looked at the circles and symbols on the scroll. This was the E family's method of calculation. But other than EC, there was no other E family member here. However, when they were on the other side of the sea, EC already knew that Xiao Xian was very good at calculations. That was why he calmed down after a moment of shock. "You want me to solve this?" EC asked. "That's right. As for the reward, you can name it." These were some difficulties Xiao Xian had encountered in his calculation. He couldn't solve them yet because he used many of the E family's strange calculations. That was why Xiao Xian came to look for EC. "Reward?" EC thought for a moment. "I haven't thought of anything yet. I'll bring it up next time. If you bring up more than what I can do, I can't pay you." "Don't worry, I know that. My strength is that I can adapt to the situation and see things clearly." EC didn't say much. He still had a lot of unfinished business. He had to quickly solve Xiao Xian's problem. Once EC started calculating, he wouldn't stop easily. He held a pen in one hand and quickly tapped on it with the other. Xiao Xian took out a small piece of animal skin scroll. It looked much simpler than the dozens of pages of cloth accounts that EC had received. However, the contents inside were not simple. It was quite complicated. It was the essence of the E family's pride. It was just a small piece of animal skin, but the items listed on it made EC spend half a day calculating. By the time he was done, the sun had already set. "Here." EC wrote down the results of his calculations on the animal skin scroll and tossed it to Xiao Xian. He rubbed his eyes. "Remember the reward you promised. Don't worry, I won't go back on my word." Xiao Xian took the animal skin scroll and left. This was only one step of the calculation. He still had to do the rest himself. Chapter 734. Inside the Flaming River Castle, the sound of hammering had stopped. As for what Yinjiao had made, no one knew. Yinjiao didn't want to reveal it either. Everything gradually calmed down and returned to normal. Occasionally, someone would mention the meteorite. Some people guessed that Yinjiao had made a divine weapon and was hiding it carefully, afraid that it would be stolen. Some people thought that Yinjiao must not have made anything. They might have even destroyed the meteorite. They just didn't say it out loud because of their reputation. No matter what everyone thought, the Flaming Horns remained silent. Even some of the Flaming Horn warriors were curious. But none of the chiefs seemed to have any intention to explain. If someone went up to ask, they would just stare at the person with a strange expression on their face. They wouldn't say a word. They would just stare at the person who asked until the person couldn't take the pressure anymore and stopped asking. At this time, inside the Flaming River Castle, Zheng Luo, who was guarding the trading area, and Duo Kong, who had just sent a batch of fearsome beasts over, were in a room inside the Flaming River Castle. They were looking at the newly forged knife. Zheng Luo even used a small copper pot in the room to test the knife. Looking at the copper pot that was split in half, Zheng Luo clicked his tongue in wonder. Only now did they know that other than copper, there were other types of metal that were suitable for making weapons. "What kind of metal is this?" Xiao Xian said the one before was called copper. "What about this one?" Duo Kong asked. Zheng Luo shook his head. "I don't know. But speaking of which, did the people who saw Xiao Xian go back to the secret room?" "He seems to be thinking about something." Duo Kong was also puzzled. In the underground secret room of the Flaming River Castle, Xiao Xian stared at the results of his calculations for the past few days. He circled one of the symbols with a pen. It was the symbol that was marked on the E family's ring diagram. Letting out a long sigh, Xiao Xian rolled up the animal skin scroll on the table and tied up the other pieces of cloth that were used as drafts. He would burn them later. He only needed to keep the final result. This conclusion was based on several assumptions. If these assumptions were true, then the main component of the crystal core should be iron. Although Xiao Xian had long believed that it was a metal alloy, he could not draw a conclusion because there was no theoretical support. Now, Xiao Xian was even more convinced. Ironware. Xiao Xian sat by the stone table, tapping his fingers on the table as he pondered. Their current technology was limited, or they wouldn't be so popular with bronzeware. Even the Gongjia family, who were famous for their craftsmanship, mainly used bronzeware. It was clear that smelting ironware was not easy. Xiao Xian couldn't do anything about it. He wasn't a professional. Due to the core seed, there were many special things in this world that had to be done according to the current situation. However, the Yinjiao people really didn't have much talent in this area. They came into contact late, and some of their thinking was already fixed. They also had poor foundations. It was too difficult to achieve anything in this area. They were training new talents, but this would take time. Xiao Xian was still thinking when Duo Kong called him. What is it? Xiao Xian pushed the stone door open. Someone's looking for you. Duo Kang's expression was serious. Who? The Chonglis. The Chonglis? Why were they here again? Weren't Wu He and the rest released as promised? Wu He and the rest were much more obedient now. The Yinjiao people didn't capture them either. No matter what, there was something strange about this. The other party specifically asked for Xiao Xian. This was even more suspicious. When Xiao Xian entered the room, he saw a person sitting there with an "I'm not happy" aura. The person didn't look strong, even skinny. His gaze was as sharp as a knife. When Xiao Xian entered, his gaze was like a knife cutting back and forth. There was no murderous intent. However, this person who almost had impatience written all over his face was obviously in a bad mood. Otherwise, he wouldn't be acting like this. Xiao Xian was stunned at the door for a moment before entering. He ignored the other party's knife-like gaze and dragged a chair over to sit down. I didn't expect the Chongli's leader to come here again. This person was the leader of the Chongli's, Su Li. Wu He told Xiao Xian his name later. Last time, because of Wu He, Su Li came here and agreed to Yinjiao's request to deliver a letter. They didn't expect him to come here again. If he wanted to steal something, he wouldn't appear here so openly and ask for Xiao Xian. Hearing Xiao Xian's question, Su Li snorted impatiently. You think I want to come here? Because they'd met before, Su Li didn't need to confirm his identity. He dug in his clothes and took out a cylindrical bronze object. Then he threw it at Xiao Xian. For you. Duo Kong and Zheng Luo wanted Xiao Xian to be careful. They didn't trust the Chonglis and were wary of any tricks. Seeing their reactions, Su Li snickered but didn't say anything. Xiao Xian caught the cylindrical object and looked at it. He saw some cloud-like patterns on the surface and was surprised. I think you know who this is. Su Li stood up. I've brought the item. Let's go. The Chonglis were supposed to be free and unfettered, looking for fun everywhere. Since when did these people start treating the Chonglis as messengers across the sea? Yes, it was the Yinjiao who started it. They couldn't let this continue. But every time the messengers gave him a reason, he couldn't refute. It was so frustrating. Last time, it was because of Wu He and the other little bastards. This time, it was because he owed Gong Jiaheng a favor. Gong Jiaheng had made him a handy tool, but he didn't ask for anything in return. He only said he would ask Su Li for help if he needed it. He didn't expect him to be a messenger. As the leader of the Chonglis, although he had done a lot of bad things, he still kept his word. He had to keep his promise. Hence, he brought the item Gong Jiaheng gave him. It was precisely because of the anger in his heart that Su Li did not have a pleasant expression on his face this time. He hurriedly left, afraid that the flaming horns would make an offer that he could not refuse. Before Xiao Xian could speak, the Chongli's leader's silhouette flickered and slid out of the window like the wind. When Duo Kong looked out, all he saw was a long-winged bird flying away. What is this? Who asked him to send it here? Zhang Luo walked over to Xiao Xian to look at the cylindrical object. Gongjia Heng. Xiao Xian showed Zhang Luo the cloud-like patterns on the cylindrical object. The cloud-like patterns weren't drawn randomly. It was a secret signal of the Gongjia family. There was a message hidden inside, and it was hard to fake. The Changli's leader didn't have to painstakingly make a fake pattern and send it all the way here. The cylindrical object was also exquisitely made. It must have been made by the Gongjia family. He opened the cylindrical object to reveal a scroll inside. The material was exquisite, in the style of the royal city. After reading the contents, Xiao Xian knew what Gongjia Heng meant. Inside, Gongjia Heng briefly explained the situation in the royal city. The gist was that the situation in the royal city was delicate because of the people in the desert. The second son, Ji Fang, had seized the throne and eliminated all opposition forces. Gongjia Heng didn't go into the details. His main point was that there were people he wanted to help among those who were to be eliminated. Because Gongjia Heng had helped Ji Fang forge swords, Ji Fang had agreed to exile those who weren't involved. Now that the situation was chaotic, Gongjia Heng was worried that the exiled people would be threatened by others. He didn't want those people to come to the mainland. At least they could have a better life with their forging skills and have a new start. To put it bluntly, what Gongjia Heng meant was that these people were all in the technical field, not politics. They weren't scheming and were rare talents. They were just ostracized because of the new situation in the royal city. They might even lose their lives. Would you take them in? Bullshit, yes. Of course. Xiao Xian was in need of blacksmiths. Since Gongjia Heng was willing to protect them, they must be capable. After all, Gongjia Heng wasn't close to the Gongjia family. However, he valued talents. Plus, if Gongjia Heng valued them, they wouldn't be scheming. Gongjia Heng said that these people had taken the desert route, avoiding the center of the war. However, he wasn't sure if they would pass through the desert successfully. If Xiao Xian wanted to take them in, he hoped to meet them in the desert. Inside the cylinder was a small bronze oval ball, half the size of a fist. When he opened the ball, there was a curled-up flying insect inside. It looked like a wasp, but there were some differences. Its wings were longer than its body, but they were soft and flexible. When it curled up, it wrapped around its body. According to Gongjia Heng, this flying insect had a very sensitive sense of smell. Similar to the Bailuo, it was trained to track. When the environment wasn't good enough for it to survive, it would enter a state of suspended animation. Only when the environment recovered would it be released. However, there was a time limit to this as well. At most, it could last for a year. Some lasted for a short time, depending on the individual. Not long after Xiao Xian opened the ball, the dead insect began to move its legs. Xiao Xian quickly closed the ball again. He hadn't started tracking yet, so he couldn't let the insect out. Plus, this place was far from the desert. There was no point in letting it out. What if it ran away and disappeared? Xiao Xian didn't know what it ate. Gongjia Heng didn't mention it either. He probably forgot. It was better to wait until they reached the desert. Xiao Xian, what do you plan to do? Zhang Luo had read the contents too. To be honest, he was tempted too. These were the Gongjia family. If they hadn't encountered such a situation, they wouldn't have this opportunity. However, the desert was said to be very dangerous. Was it worth the trip? Xiao Xian put the scroll into the cylinder and the small ball into it. Then he covered the cylinder with the lid. Yes, of course I'm going. Yinjiao lacks blacksmiths too, especially with the new metal products. If we rely on ourselves, we won't be able to develop much. It's better to leave professional matters to professionals. It's more efficient. Plus, I've been planning to go to the desert. His decision wasn't just because of Gongjia Heng's letter, or the rumors about the strange people in the desert. It was because he sensed movement from Sapphire. Chapter 735. Xiao Xian had decided to go to the desert, but the Yinjiao people would not let Xiao Xian go alone. Plus, they were there to recruit people. If the target was someone else, Yinjiao would not care so much. However, this was the Gongjia family, especially the Yinjiao people from the other side of the sea. When they heard about the Gongjia family, Their eyes lit up as if there was a mountain of treasure. They would not let go of this opportunity, especially when they had discovered a new type of metal. They needed people in this field to speed up their improvement. After experiencing the benefits of the new bronze, Yinjiao people valued excellent tools even more. According to Gong Jiaheng's letter, there should be about 10 people coming. Perhaps only 1 or 2 of them were important while the rest were apprentices. However, Yinjiao did not mind. These apprentices were still apprentices of the Gongjia family and had much more experience than Yinjiao craftsmen. When Gigu, Ao and the rest heard the news, they all had the same decision. Take them all. Take as many as you can. As for whether they could be trusted, they would bring them back first. If they were not trustworthy, then don't blame Yinjiao for being ruthless. It was not good to bring too many people to the desert. Too many people would make them a big target, and it would not be a good place to hide. They were only there to recruit people, not to join the war. Plus, Yinjiao could not afford to send too many people. In the end, Xiaoxian decided to bring 100 people. These people were carefully selected. Duokong wanted to join but Ta wanted to go too. According to the old rules, one of the 2 team leaders had to stay in the territory. The last time Duokong went out to sea, because it was about the people from Taiha, Ta and the others didn't know them, so he didn't have any objections. But this time, Duokong and the others didn't know the people they were going to pick up. Since everyone wasn't familiar with the people they were going to pick up, Ta had something to say. In the end, Duokong stayed in the territory while Ta went to the desert. It wasn't going to be an easy task this time. One of them was the legendary monsters in the desert. Even though Rock Hill City's main target was the seaside, no one knew how many of them were eyeing other parts of the desert. Secondly, Xiaoxian knew that other than the threat of Rock Hill City, there were other uncertainties. Why did he say that? If Gong Jiaheng could ask Su Li to deliver the letter, why didn't he ask Su Li to deliver the person directly? After all, the Chonglis had long-winged birds that could fly long distances. Perhaps the Chonglis had their own safer flight route. If the Chonglis could help, there wouldn't be so much trouble. However, the reality was that Heng did not do that. Or rather, Heng wanted to but the Changles did not agree. Based on Heng's letter, they could guess the reason behind this. The Changles were unwilling to help because they did not want to cause trouble. There were other people on the other side of the sea who were also keeping an eye on the target. After all, he was a Gongjia member. If Yinjiao wanted to recruit him, why didn't the others? The people on the other side were even more aware of the Gongjia family's capabilities. Other than that, there might be people who wanted to kill him. Although the new king had agreed to banish the target, who knew if there were other orders behind the scenes? Delivering the letter would not attract attention, but transporting the person would be a huge target. The Chonglis did not want to cause trouble. They set off from Yinjiao towards the desert. The closer they got to the desert, the more they felt a deathly stillness. Back then, the desert was called a dead land, but there were still traces of human activity near the edge of the desert. Small to medium-sized tribes like the Rain tribe lived there. Now the Rain tribe had moved away. Perhaps the other tribes had left too. Perhaps they had disappeared for other reasons. Anyway, when they came here again, they had not even set foot in the desert. The weather here is still so bad, said Tua. Years ago, when Xiaoxian, Tua and Lei Di came here and rested at the Rain tribe, they had also encountered sand and dust storms. Now that they were here, it seemed to be worse. If this continues, the desertification will worsen, and the desert will expand faster. Xiaoxian pointed at the ground beneath his feet. This wasn't like this before. Although there were no forests, at least there were some weeds. Now there are only sand and rocks. The place where the Rain tribe used to live has all turned into sand. Lei remembered the first time he came to the desert. The Rain tribe's decision to move was the right one. After the Rain tribe left, the weather became drier. Without the Rain tribe, there was less rain. During the disaster, much of the desert disappeared. If this continued, it might not be as big as before in 1,000 years, but it would definitely be much bigger than the desert now. Xiaoxian left 50 people outside the desert, while he brought the remaining 50 into the desert. They had 4 spiritual rain stones. The Rain tribe would not trade them away. Even though the people of the Rain tribe no longer needed the stones to collect water, the stones were symbolic to the Rain tribe. Especially after the migration, it was difficult to find any more spiritual rain stones. The ones in their hands were even more precious. Now there were 4 spiritual rain stones. One of them was given to Xiaoxian by Yinjiao, and the other 3 were rented from the Rain tribe by Yinjiao. For this, they even paid some materials as the rental fee. This was for the sake of Yinjiao. After all, the Rain tribe was now on Yinjiao's side. If it were someone else, the Rain tribe would never lend out their spiritual rain stones, let alone 3. He kept one for each of the 50 people outside the desert. Outside the desert, the weather was better than inside the desert. The rain stones could gather water droplets more efficiently too. However, once they entered the desert, the rain stones would not gather water droplets as quickly. That was why Xiaoxian brought 3 rain stones. He kept one for himself, and gave the other 2 to Ta and Xiangchen. They were divided into 3 teams. If they split up, they would be responsible for the water supply for their subordinates. The dry and hot wind mixed with sand and dust hit their faces. It was not comfortable for people who were used to the wet forest. Xiaoxian and the others covered their mouths and noses with cloth, and walked forward on the sand. Today's weather was not good. Not long after entering the desert, there was a sandstorm. Xiaoxian found a place to rest for a while. When the sandstorm stopped, he opened the cylinder and took out the small oval ball. He twisted it open. The thumb-sized flying insect that was curled up into a ball moved its legs after a short while. Then, the pair of membranous wings that were tightly wrapped around its body also loosened. It stretched its body and flapped its wings, flipping its body over. Its 2 long antennae were propped up and swayed. Perhaps it had just woken up, or it was not used to the desert environment. After the insect flipped over, it rested in the oval ball for a while. Then, it used its developed upper jaw to scrape the inner wall of the oval ball. So the food is here. Xiaoxian picked up the other half of the oval ball. There was indeed some waxy material on the inner wall. When Hung locked the insect inside, he must have thought of the possibility of this happening. After eating and waking up, the insect used its forelimbs to flick its antennae and flapped its wings to fly. "Follow it," said Xiaoxian. The insect did not linger in the same spot. Instead, it flew in one direction. This meant it could find its target here. Chapter 736. The continuous sand dunes blocked their line of sight. All they could see was the sand on the dunes being blown up by gusts of wind. He was surrounded by yellow sand, and there were no other green plants. In fact, he couldn't even see any plants. Not even a single one of those powerful plants in the desert could be seen. A man in ragged clothes climbed up the sand dunes step by step. He was a tall young man with broad shoulders and a strong body. The muscles on his exposed arms were taut. He dragged a simple stone hammer in one hand. At first glance, it was obvious that it was made on the spot. The stone hammer was not decorated, nor was there a hole. Instead, it was a stone and a stone stick. It was tied together with a very tough vine in the desert, and there were even strips of cloth added to it. The crisscrossing wounds on his exposed arms had already closed. One could clearly see the coagulated blood mixed with sand and dust. With every step he took, he could feel the stinging pain from the wounds all over his body. However, after getting used to it, he became numb and gradually ignored the pain. Not far behind him were a few people with unkempt hair and dirty faces. The color of their clothes was unrecognizable. Their lips were cracked due to lack of water, and they were slightly pale. Their eyes were blank as they mechanically followed the person in front of them. If they had a choice, they would not even want to breathe. The air was too hot and dry. The wind carried the scent of death and despair. "Darun, do you see anything ahead?" a slightly older man asked. His voice was hoarse and sluggish, and every single word was spoken with great difficulty, as if it was squeezed out slowly. The person who had climbed up the sand dune used the stone hammer to support himself. Most of his body weight was on the stone hammer to lighten the load. He looked into the distance. He was originally carrying a sword in his hand. That sword was the most successful weapon he had ever made. Craftsmen always liked to carry their outstanding work with them. It was also a display of their abilities. However, in this place, those outstanding results had become something that attracted danger. Until now, the only thing he could carry was a simple stone hammer that he would not even spare a glance at in the past. Hearing his subordinate's question, Gong Jiaren shook his head and dragged the stone hammer down. The people who had a glimmer of hope were once again filled with a deathly stillness when they heard this reply. They had been walking in this desert for 17 days. After living for so many years, when had they ever been in such a sorry state? This was the first time they had encountered such hardships. Back in the royal city, when they said they were part of the Gongjia family, people would naturally rush over to give them gifts. They had slaves to serve them, and all they had to do every day was forge. They did not have to worry about anything else. But now they regretted it. He regretted not learning more survival skills, regretted not following the right person, regretted taking this step. If he had stayed in the royal city and chosen another path, would it have been better? 10 of them came together, but one of them was shot dead when they crossed the sea. No one knew where the arrow came from. Fortunately, Gong Jiaren was vigilant enough to lead the group out of harm's way. Otherwise, more people would have died. But after stepping into the desert, they realized that it was even more difficult. They managed to evade their pursuers and Rock Hill City members, but the desert was a dangerous place. Of the remaining 9 people, 2 had been eaten by desert beasts, and 1 had betrayed them by stealing Gong Jiaren's sword. He probably wanted to use Gong Jiaren's sword to seek refuge with the desert bandits. Yes, other than Rock Hill City members, there were a few scattered factions in the desert. Some were formed by former slaves, while others were controlled by escaped slave masters. Now that Rock Hill City had changed their target and ignored them, these small factions had a chance to catch their breaths. These people did not dare to provoke Rock Hill City, but instead, they killed and robbed others who passed through the desert. As the 2 continents neared each other, many people came from the other side. They wanted to cross the desert from a place far away from Rock Hill City, but it would make things easier for the desert bandits. The desert bandits did not want to get too close to Rock Hill City. In the 17 days in the desert, they had seen many skeletons buried in the sand. No one knew who they were or where they came from. Along the way, they had seen a group of desert bandits. They buried themselves in sand and hid behind sand dunes to avoid danger. Now there were only 6 of them left. If only we could find a water source now. A person slightly younger than Gong Jiaren licked his cracked lips. Seeing that everyone was in low spirits, he took a deep breath and forced a smile, comforting them. There will be a turn for the better. At least we're still alive. One of them groaned helplessly as if he had a toothache. He threw away the stone in his hand as a weapon. Because of hunger, thirst, and the difficulties along the way, even if he wanted to roar to vent his anger, he could only shout weakly like a sigh. I'd rather die than continue to walk in such a place. Die. As soon as he finished, he felt something was wrong beneath his feet. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Although they didn't have much experience in such an environment, after so many days, they had developed a sense of vigilance towards danger. Watch out! Gong Jiaren shouted. A sand lizard suddenly leapt out from the sand, biting the legs of the person who was about to retreat and dragging him down. The others did not have the time to sigh and lament, hurriedly hugging the person's upper body. 2 of their companions had been eaten by sand beasts, and one of them was dragged down like this. It happened so fast they could not pull him away. Although the sand lizard had no teeth, its jaws were very strong. The person could not kick his legs away. The more he struggled, the tighter the lizard's jaws became. It even pulled backwards, as if trying to snatch its prey away from its companions. The person who was bitten cried out in pain. This was not the weak sigh from before, but an even more miserable cry. He did not doubt that if this continued, his legs would be torn apart. Bang! A stone hammer smashed into the lizard's head, making a sound like a hard object colliding. A palm-sized piece of scale on the lizard's scale-covered head was smashed off. Blood flowed out and its jaws loosened. The person who escaped the beast's jaws ignored the pain in his legs and hurriedly retreated, searching for the rock he threw down. They did not have any weapons, so they could only pick up some rocks to use as weapons, or some animal or human bones they saw along the way. The others also threw stones at the sand lizard, or used sharpened bones to stab the sand lizard. Unfortunately, the sand lizard saw that the situation was not good, and wanted to escape. Another hammer came down, and the airflow from the hammer made a whistling sound as it hit the sand lizard's eyes. A sound like gravel grinding came from the lizard's mouth. Its retreating head was smashed to the side. The others hurriedly followed, smashing and stabbing the lizard's injured head. After they were out of danger, they realized that this was food that they rarely saw. Everyone stared at the lizard with a fierce green light in their eyes. Finally, after a small part of the sand lizard was forcibly pulled out from the sand, it died under the joint attack of the 6 people. Gong Jiaren fell on his butt, panting heavily. After smashing the lizard 3 times, he had exhausted almost all his strength to pull it out from the sand. It wasn't just Gong Jiaren. The others were also sitting on the sand, too weak to stand up. However, if this lizard was not dealt with quickly, it would attract other sand beasts. Hence, the 6 of them did not have time to rest. Gong Jiaren crawled over and drank the lizard's blood. He did not know if the blood was poisonous, but he had no choice. The blood was thick with a fishy smell, and there were many grains of sand. They could not care less as they all crawled onto the lizard's dead body, licking its blood and flesh like other desert beasts. They were forced to do so by survival. Rustle, rustle, rustle. The sound of sand sliding could be heard. The 6 of them looked around vigilantly. With one look, their pupils shrank, and their faces turned pale with fright. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A total of 5 lizards emerged from the sand and surrounded them. The lizard just now had exhausted them. Although they drank some blood, they could not recover in such a short time, let alone 5 lizards at the same time. It's over. That was the only thing they could think of. WWW, what should we do? One of them trembled. His face was covered in blood from licking the lizard's blood. When the wind blew, sand stuck to his face. He could no longer see his face clearly, only his terrified eyes. What else could they do? They could either wait for death, or fight to the death. These were their only 2 choices. Run. With their current strength, could they outrun the lizards? Gong Jiaren closed his eyes, gripping the stone hammer tightly. They had no way out. Well, they had no way out when they were in the royal city. It was Gong Jiaheng who told them to run this way. That was how they managed to survive for so long. They had wasted so much of Gong Jiaheng's energy, but in the end, they still could not escape. Since they could not avoid death, they had to fight. Gong Jiaren opened his eyes abruptly and looked at the approaching lizards. He dragged the stone hammer and stood up, wiping away the blood around his eyes to avoid interfering with his vision. To run! The person lying next to the dead lizard wiped his face when he saw Gong Jiaren's reaction. He picked up the rocks and bones beside him. Although they knew the weapons in their hands were useless against these lizards, they had no other weapons. It was better to have something than to be empty-handed. If they could not survive, they could end their own lives. Gong Jiaren rushed to the front as he watched the approaching lizards. His eyes were filled with determination as he roared. The lizards that were closing in on Gong Jiaren turned and ran. Gong Jiaren, who had already raised his stone hammer. Everyone else. They looked at the other lizards surrounding them. They had all run away, running as fast as they could, as if they were running for their lives. Boom! Sand exploded somewhere on the ground. A lizard was sent flying, rolling a few times in the air. A figure rushed out from the sand, glowing blue under the scorching sun. What a big worm! Chapter 737. Gong Jiaren's eyelids twitched as he stared at the beast that was much taller than him. He felt a chill run down his spine and into his brain. A large crater had appeared in the sand that had exploded in front of him. The flying sand blurred his vision, and sand fell from all directions like a torrential rain. The beast had appeared too quickly for him to dodge. All he could do was crouch down, not daring to move. He hoped the beast would focus on the sand lizards. As soon as it shifted its gaze away, he would immediately burrow into the sand and play dead. Although he did not know if playing dead would work against a beast like this, he had no other choice. He did not have the energy to run, let alone escape. The sand lizards were flipped over by the giant worm. All 5 sand lizards ran for their lives as if they had seen their natural predator. The few of them were no match for the worm. The rest were no better off than Gongjiaren. Earlier, they thought Gongjiaren's domineering aura had scared the 5 sand lizards away. They did not expect an even more powerful one to jump out of nowhere. Their faces paled even further as they tried to control their breathing, afraid that they would attract the giant worm's attention. They dared not wipe away the sand that flew into their eyes. They could only blink hard and crouch down to reduce their presence. Their eyes were focused on the movements of the giant worm, thinking about what to do next. There were 5 sand lizards just now. Even if each of them faced one, the one with more wouldn't have a chance to escape, because the sand lizards had enough time to finish off the others and chase after the remaining one. Now a big worm had scared the sand lizards away. Although it looked very powerful, there were 6 of them. Would there be a chance for some of them to escape? Even if they could escape, would they have the energy to do so? They looked at each other, understanding each other's intentions. When the giant worm suddenly chased after one of the sand lizards, they immediately crouched down and dug a hole in the sand to bury themselves. This method was effective against some beasts in the desert, but it was completely useless against others. They didn't know if the big bug would discover them, but they could only do this. They didn't have the strength to run. If the cover of the sand didn't work, they could only accept their fate and wait for death. They could hear booming sounds coming from the sand, as if wooden stakes were smashing down. An invisible pressure filled the surroundings, and the originally difficult breathing became even more careful. After the whooshing sound of something breaking through the air, another boom sounded on the sandy ground. The strong wind blew a large amount of sand, and the feeling of it falling on one's body was like dense rain. They didn't dare to look up. They could only rely on their hearing to determine what was happening outside the sand. The big bug was hunting the sand lizards. Just now, it sounded 4 times in different directions. Did it mean that the 4-legged sand lizards had been killed? With the sudden collapse, he could even feel the sand covering his body becoming heavier and heavier, making it harder for him to breathe. The sand was still shaking. Although it was far from them, this distance was not enough to get them out of danger. Every time they took a careful breath in the sand, they felt as if their throats and lungs were being ground by the sand. It was extremely uncomfortable. The scorching sand on their backs felt as if it was going to cook their entire backs. They did not dare to use their strength to resist, so they could only endure it. Just as they were counting the sounds and anticipating that the big bug would chase after the sand lizards, they suddenly realized that not only was the sound not moving further away, it was actually getting closer. Now, their slightly relieved hearts were in their throats again. Especially Gongjiaren. He could tell that the sound was coming towards him. There were 2 sounds, one in front and one behind. The one in front was probably the sand lizard, and the one behind must be the big bug. Motherfucker! Why is the sand lizard coming this way? Gongjiaren cursed the sand lizard in his heart a few times, but could not change its direction. Boom! There was another explosion of sand, stirring up a strong gust of wind with the roar of a desert beast. The sand and dust on the ground flew in all directions like blooming flowers. Gongjiaren, who was closest to the explosion, was not spared even though he was sprawled on the ground. The wind and sand came crashing towards him like a violent gust of wind. Gongjiaren felt like someone had punched him in the back. He couldn't help letting out a muffled groan as his body was flung high into the air by the force of the impact. Then he crashed to the ground. However, the noise was muffled by the giant worm's pursuit of the sand lizard, so no one knew what happened to Gongjiaren. Gongjiaren felt his stomach churn. He almost vomited out the little bit of blood and meat he had eaten earlier. His body, which had not recovered, was now in a worse state. It was difficult for him to even stand now. He wanted to bury himself again as soon as possible, but his arms felt like they were chained to a boulder. It was difficult to even move. Even the sound of bones cracking could be heard. In Gongjiaren's blurry vision, he saw the blue figure with its 2 scythe-like forelimbs nailed to the sand lizard's body. The sound of sharp weapons slicing through hard armor and flesh rang clearly in Gongjiaren's ears. Everything finally came to a stop. The flying sand landed on the sand with a soft thud, then gradually quieted down. The atmosphere was still tense. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It was the sound of sand being kicked up by the big bug as it walked across the sand. The danger had yet to pass. The people in hiding continued to hide, not daring to come out. They did not even dare to lift their heads. However, Gong Jiarun was having a hard time. He saw the big bug walking towards him with a sand lizard nailed to one of its forelimbs. Am I going to die? Gong Jiarun's consciousness began to blur as he watched the big bug approach. However, he was much calmer than before. Perhaps he knew he could not escape, so he gave up on the idea of escaping and waited for death to come. Many thoughts flashed through his mind. Then he closed his eyes. The people hiding in the sand listened to the sounds outside the sand. After some strange noises, they finally left. When everything returned to normal, they carefully lifted their heads and shook off the sand on their bodies. It's finally gone. I almost suffocated to death. It's so hot. I'm so hungry. Are they all here? Are they all still alive? And where's Darun? Darun, where are you? They shouted a few times, but did not get any response. Panicking, they ran towards where Gong Jiarun was and dug in the sand for a long time. All they found was Gong Jiarun's simple stone hammer. He was nowhere to be seen. It wasn't just Gong Jiarun. The 5 sand lizards were nowhere to be seen. There were only some blood stains and scales. Could it be that the big bug took the desert beasts and Darun away? Chapter 738. Xiao Xian and the rest followed the insect as it ran through the desert. The insect had great endurance and would only rest at night. When it was hungry, it would scrape the waxy food inside the oval ball. Xiao Xian would also feed it some water. It was such a small insect, it wouldn't consume much water anyway. While following the flying insect, Xiao Xian also sensed Sapphire's presence. At first, he planned to look for the person first. Now finding the person was the most important thing. Once he found the person, he would look for Sapphire. After all, he had a connection with Sapphire. As his first slave, Sapphire's bond with Xiao Xian was even stronger. Now that Sapphire was awake and not in danger, Xiao Xian did not pay special attention to it. If Sapphire sensed him, it would come looking for him on its own. For example, Xiao Xian could sense Sapphire heading in his direction. Coincidentally, Sapphire was in the direction they were heading. If they kept walking in that direction, they would meet it. They found a rocky spot to rest, replenish their water, and adjust their condition before continuing their search. We didn't see any of those legendary monsters. Tua scanned their surroundings. The heat from the sand was distorting the air. Tua didn't sense anyone else's aura, and there were no dangerous beasts either. He opened the water bottle and drank some water. He felt something under his feet, and used his feet to push the sand on the surface of the ground to the side, revealing a white skeleton below. They had seen this many times. Along the way, they would occasionally stumble and find bones under the sand. Some belonged to humans, some belonged to beasts. It shouldn't have been long, or there wouldn't even be bones left in this desert. From the wounds on the bones, the fatal injury was caused by a sharp weapon, not a beast's claws or teeth. It looked more like a human's weapon. Other than the monsters from Rock Hill City, there are also desert bandits in the desert. Everyone be careful, said Xiao Xian. Ah Xian, do you think that person from the Gongjia family is still alive? Asked Lei. The conditions in the desert were harsh. Other than the climate, there was also the threat of perspiration. The Gongjia family only had 10 people. Could they really survive until they found them? It's certain that he's still alive. If he was eaten by a sand beast or killed, he wouldn't even have a complete corpse in this place. In that case, the flying insects will stop. Xiao Xian had read about this in Heng's scroll. Heng had said that if the insects stopped and lingered around for a long time, they would not need to continue searching. This only meant that those people were not lucky enough to last until they were found. So that's how it is. That means the person we're looking for is still alive. That's great. Lei smiled. He did not want to come to the desert and not see any skilled people, only some incomplete bones. As they were talking, they noticed that Xiao Xian was staring in one direction. Tua asked, Xian, what did you find? Xiao Xian shook his head. I just sensed Sapphire's movement. It's coming this way. We should be able to see it soon. Sapphire? It's here. Tua, Lei and the rest looked around. They still remembered Xiaoxian's beetle. When he first started, it was small and could be squashed to death with one finger. When Xiaoxian brought Jingluo and the rest here, Sapphire appeared again, and was already taller than them. "It's been so long. I wonder if it's grown," said Lei. "It must have grown a little." Based on past patterns, Sapphire's body would grow bigger every time it was unlocked. Now that the fourth lock had been unlocked, it must be bigger than the third lock. Xiaoxian thought. A few of them had never seen Sapphire before. They had only heard about it from others, but now that they thought about it, they could not remember. The only thing they remembered was that the insect could cause an insect swarm. It was said that an insect swarm was one of the scariest things in the desert. It was no worse than a sandstorm. Now that they thought about it, they were looking forward to seeing an insect swarm. After resting, he continued on his journey. On the afternoon of the second day, Xiaoxian suddenly stopped walking and looked ahead. Ta and the rest covered Yang Guang with their hands and looked in that direction. Something was approaching. Not a human but a beast. Ta wanted to warn everyone, but Xiaoxian waved his hand. "It's Sapphire." "Sapphire?" Tua looked ahead. After a while, he saw a large ball appear on the sand dune. Yes, a large ball. It looked like it was made of sand, and there seemed to be something on it. After crossing the sand ridge, the ball rolled down the slope of the sand dune. "Dodge!" Ta and the others cleared a path for the ball to roll past them. The 10-meter-tall ball rolled across the sand, creating a gust of wind. They could clearly feel its size and weight. However, everyone's line of sight didn't stay on the sand ball for long. Soon, they noticed that behind the sand ball, there was a blue figure that was rapidly approaching. Ray's jaw almost dropped. He pointed at the approaching big bug. "Blue. That's the bug." "That's it." Xiaoxian nodded. "You call that a little?" Ray looked at the beetle that was already 10 steps away. It was much taller than his house. How did it grow so big? What did it eat to become like this? The last time the beetle was lying on the ground, it was only a little taller than a person. Now it was twice as tall. The Yinjiao warrior who saw Sapphire for the first time looked at it in shock. He turned to ask the person next to him in a low voice. "Didn't you say it was only as tall as a person?" "The last time I saw it, it wasn't that big," another person cried out. On the other side, Sapphire was very happy to see Xiaoxian. It circled Xiaoxian a few times. Because the others were standing with Xiaoxian, Sapphire circled them. Even though they knew the bug wasn't a threat to them, some people couldn't help but feel nervous. After all, such a big guy was so close to them. It made them feel stressed. After circling a few times, Sapphire hurriedly chased after the sand ball that had rolled far away. It stood upside down and rolled the ball back to Xiaoxian with its hind legs. As a slave, this was its greeting gift to its master. It had collected a lot of food and rolled it all together. Collecting things, rolling them into balls and playing with them, was its hobby. After rolling the sand ball in front of Xiaoxian, Sapphire stood at the side and waited. It looked like a slave waiting for its master's evaluation. It looked nervous. At this time, everyone could see clearly what was on the sand ball. Although the sand ball was mainly made up of sand, there were also beast claws and scales that were exposed on the outside. "There's a sand beast in it." Ray curiously leaned over. "How did this ball come out?" "The sand is so strong that it didn't fall apart." Xiaoxian didn't answer. He saw the bug hovering above the sand ball and had a bad feeling. Xiaoxian's expression froze when he saw the skeletons in the ball. A bright flash of a sword flashed and the sand ball was cut open. A person rolled out of the hole. "Ha ha ha, who's this?" "Poor thing, Sapphire wrapped him in a ball." Ray and the rest laughed. "Who is this? Someone from Rock Hill City? A desert robber?" The latter was more likely. After all, there weren't many normal people in Rock Hill City. As for desert robbers, they weren't good people anyway. Their lives didn't matter to them. But soon, they saw the bug circle in the air and land on the person who had rolled out of the sand dune. His hair was messy and his face was dirty. They couldn't see his face at all. Xiaoxian. The others. They couldn't laugh anymore. Holy shit. No way. This bug was used to find a target. For the sake of accuracy, Gong Jiaheng had ordered the bug to only search for a single target. There would be no mistakes. Now the flying insect that was used to find the target had stopped on a person who looked like he had stopped breathing. Everyone rushed over to him. Ta personally checked whether the person who had been left motionless was still breathing. If he was dead, their trip would be in vain. After checking, Ta slowly exhaled. His breathing is weak, but he's still alive. His condition isn't good. Let him drink it first. Xiao Xian had already melted a pill in a flask and passed it to Ta. This person is the Gongjia guy we're looking for? Tua looked at the person on the ground and asked Xiao Xian. From the looks of the bug, it's him. Xiao Xian looked at Gongjia Ren on the ground. His injuries are quite serious. I wonder what else he encountered before meeting Sapphire. At this, Xiao Xian looked at Sapphire, who was standing at the side. Sapphire probably realized it had made a mistake and ruffled the sand anxiously. It had wanted to please its master, but in the end, it had almost killed his master's target. It had grabbed the Gongjia ligament with its claws when it was wrapping the lizard. If its target was a human, it would not have let the others hiding in the sand go. I fed him the medicine. As for what happens next, we'll have to wait and see. Ta stood up. Since the key person had been found, they were not in a hurry to continue. Instead, they found a place to rest. It was almost sunset, and they had to settle the injured Gongjia Ren down. They found a suitable spot and set up a tent. The tent's frame was made of new bronze. Every frame could be used as a weapon. When it was time to use it, they would assemble it and cover it with cloth. It was a temporary tent. 50 people were squeezed together in the tent, but if there was no sandstorm, they would also rest outside. Now this tent would be used to settle the injured Gongjia Ren down. It was rare to find him. They could not let him die just like that. Fortunately, although his injuries were serious, Gongjia Ren's condition stabilized quickly after the medicine was fed. His life was no longer in danger, and his weak pulse had become stronger. Chapter 739. It was the middle of the night when Gongjia Ren woke up. He thought he would become the desert beast's dung, but he was still alive. Gongjia Ren was still in a daze when he first woke up. It took him a while to realize that he was not dreaming, nor was he in another unknown world after death. He was still alive. He clearly remembered that before he lost consciousness, the giant bug had already walked up to him and raised its claw. But why was he still alive? Why was he not killed by the bug's claw? Plus, there were people breathing in this place. Was he saved? His surroundings were dark, but he could hear the rustling of cloth in the wind. He was inside a cloth shed. The smell of sand wafted from the ground. He was very familiar with this smell, after fleeing in the desert for so long. He was still in the desert. There were 4 people breathing around him, slow and regular. They must be asleep. Gongjia Ren sat up carefully. The pain of his broken bones almost made him groan, but he suppressed it. He dared not make a sound before he understood the situation. Someone had fed him medicine and treated his external injuries. Gongjia Ren could clearly feel that his body was much better now. Although the pain was still there, it was much better than when he was running for his life in the desert. He carefully flipped himself up and shuffled his feet on the sand. His surroundings were dark, but there was light in one spot. It was the tent of the cloth shed. The wind outside flapped the tent, and through the flickering gaps, he could see the light outside. It was the light of the moon at night. Gongjia Ren moved over and lifted the tent to look outside. Although the moon was not yet full, it was enough for him to see the situation nearby. Gongjia Ren wanted to see how many people were outside, and who they were so he could understand the current situation. However, he froze the moment he lifted the tent slightly. Outside, not far from the tent's door, a giant beetle twice as tall as a human was waiting quietly. Its head was facing the tent. When Gongjia Ren lifted the tent to look outside, the giant beetle looked up too. Gongjia Ren was speechless. He suddenly did not understand the situation. There were people around, but there was a giant beetle lying at the door. Gongjia Ren stared at the giant beetle's bluish carapace under the moonlight. He knew it was the same beetle he saw before he lost consciousness. The scene of the beetles slaughtering the sand lizards was still fresh in his mind. Just as Gongjia Ren did not know how to react, a voice came from behind him. "You just survived. Where do you think you're going?" Gongjia Ren was startled. He put down the tent and turned towards the voice. The tent lit up. Xiaoxian took the water moon stone out of his animal skin bag. With the light, Gong Jiarun could see clearly what was going on inside. Other than the young man who spoke, there were 3 other people. However, all 3 of them were awake, lying on the ground and looking at him. "You saved me?" asked Gong Jiarun. Gong Jiarun of Gong Jiarun. "Thank you," said Gong Jiarun, but he was still wary of Xiaoxian and the rest. He was saved by these people, but he did not know their motives. The giant beetle outside was obviously in cahoots with them. He could not help but think. He spoke the language of the other side of the sea, but these people spoke the same language. Only people from the other side of the sea could speak this language. Either they were from the other side of the sea, or they were from various factions in the desert. Either way, he did not want to see them. Xiaoxian saw that Gong Jiarun had not let down his guard, so he did not rush to explain. Instead, he took out the small oval ball and twisted it open. Gong Jiarun was surprised when he saw the oval ball. Of course he knew what it was, because it was his. When he saw the flying insect, Gong Jiarun turned to Xiaoxian. "Who the hell are you?" "Yinjiao." Xiaoxian tossed Heng's scroll to Gong Jiarun. "See for yourself." "Yinjiao." Heng's suggestion was for Gong Jiarun, and the rest to look for Yinjiao. He even said he would write a letter to the Yinjiao tribe for assistance. Who would have thought that they would actually come? After reading the scroll, Gong Jiarun finally let down his guard. This was Heng's handwriting and the Gongjia family's cloud code. It could not be faked. "You're Xiaoxian?" Gong Jiarun looked at the person who tossed the scroll to him. "That's me. You're Gong Jiarun? Where are your other companions?" Xiaoxian took the scroll from Gong Jiarun and rolled it up. Speaking of which, Gong Jiarun looked out the door and briefly recounted his encounter. Although he had guessed that Sapphire was the cause of this accident, Xiaoxian couldn't help but think to himself, "Thank goodness Sapphire has been asleep for too long and hasn't had the time to summon its little brothers. Otherwise, Gong Jiarun and the rest would all be dead." Xiaoxian thought that the Gongjia family was similar to Heng, but after listening to Gong Jiarun's description, he realized that not every Gongjia family member had the skills to survive in the wilderness. Most of the Gongjia family members had been learning blacksmithing since they were young under specific mentors. They would probably continue this way until they grew up, taking in apprentices and continuing to blacksmith. Many people would not look for Gongjia Mountain because they did not dare to take that step. Once they left, they did not know when they would return. Some might never return. Gong Jiarun was taken in as an apprentice by a rather famous blacksmith when he was young. He had planned to look for Gongjia Mountain and ask his master about it, but he couldn't find anyone, so he went to look for Heng instead. When his master found out, he was scolded and took back some of the materials he had given him. However, Gong Jiarun did not give up. He continued to ask Heng about Gongjia Mountain. Just as he was about to head to Gongjia Mountain, there was a coup in the royal city. Gong Jiarun's master stood on the wrong side and was killed. Even Gong Jiarun's fellow apprentices did not manage to escape. It was Gongjia Heng's plea that the new king changed the death sentence to exile. Some of his fellow disciples chose to join other factions, while others left on their own. Gong Jiarun had no idea where they went. Gong Jiarun himself went to ask Gongjia Heng, who was sending them off, where was the best place to go. Unlike Gong Jiarun and the rest, Gongjia Heng had been to many places and had a broader perspective. Gong Jiarun trusted his advice, so they followed his advice. After being exiled, they followed the planned route to cross the sea. However, they did not expect to be ambushed. There were casualties in the group, and when they finally crossed the sea, they realized that the desert was even more dangerous. They did not have the experience to survive in such a dangerous place. To the Yinjiao people, Gong Jiarun and the rest were a bunch of useless people. However, they had their own specializations. Perhaps all their strengths were in blacksmithing, and they lacked experience in other areas. They didn't even know where to start killing beasts in the fastest and most effective way. Gongjia Heng was an exception. All his survival experience and beast fighting skills were forced out of him in the forest. The difference was that Heng could use various materials in the forest to create traps to catch beasts. In the desert, There were too few materials that could be used. Sometimes, there wasn't even a rock to be found. Knowing that Gongjia Run still had 5 companions, Xiaoxian and the rest planned to look for them too. They were all talents of the Gongjia family. Since they were here, they might as well take them with them. Xiaoxian noticed that Gongjia Run was panting after speaking, so he said, "Your injuries are too serious. Rest first, we'll depart tomorrow." Chapter 740. Gongjia Run panicked. He was now sprawled on the back of the giant beetle that almost killed him. Due to his severe injuries, he would not be able to recover so quickly even after taking medicine. Even if he could run, he would not be able to keep up. If they wanted to hurry, he would either have to be carried or lie on the beetle's back. Before Gongjia Run could decide, Xiaoxian picked him up and threw him onto the beetle's back. They had planned to depart the next morning, but Xiaoxian's not divination revealed that daytime was not a good time. There would be sandstorms on their way, so they rested during the day and set off at night. In fact, they preferred to travel at night. The temperature was low at night, and they could catch some sand beasts as food. Previously, they had traveled during the day, because the tracking bug was only active during the day. If they wanted to follow the bug, they could only travel during the day. Now that they had found Gongjia Run, they did not need to rely on the beetle anymore. Gongjia Run could not remember the route, but Sapphire could. Xiaoxian and the rest only needed to follow the giant beetle. If they were tired, they could lie on the beetle's back to rest. Once they were well rested, they could run again. Needless to say, having a giant beetle like this saved them a lot of energy. Sapphire had already eaten the sand lizards in the ball. It wanted to give them to Xiaoxian, but Xiaoxian threw them to it instead. Sapphire did not need much water. It was used to the desert environment, and did not lack water easily like humans. Gongjia Run now agreed with Heng's suggestion. The Yinjiao people did not look weak. Years ago, he had heard that the Yinjiao people had sent the head of the Lu family flying with a single slap in the royal city. He had never seen it with his own eyes, only heard about the Yinjiao people. That was why he agreed when Heng suggested to look for the Yinjiao people. After all, having a strong backer would increase their chances of survival. Now he could feel the benefits. At night, the beetle's carapace was as cold as metal. Gongjia Run was still weak from his injuries, so he asked Xiaoxian for a piece of animal skin to cushion himself. He wondered how his 5 companions were doing after he left. The giant beetle only took away the 5 sand lizards that appeared later. The sand lizard that they killed together was still there. It should be enough for the 5 of them to eat and not starve to death. However, when they arrived at the place where Gongjia Run was taken away, the 5 men were nowhere to be seen. Left? Tua asked. After all, 2 days had already passed, and those people wouldn't stay in the same place for so long. No, they should be nearby. They couldn't drag the sand lizard away, but they wouldn't waste a rare prey like this. They would find a place to hide and eat the sand beast to recover their strength before continuing their journey, said Gongjia Run. This was his conjecture based on the temperament of the 5 people. But there's no one around, Xiaoxian said. Hearing this, Gongjia Run frowned. He was worried that the 5 men might have met with some other trouble after he left. Xiaoxian looked around, then walked towards a spot. He used the knife in his hand to brush away the sand on the ground. Gongjia Run's gaze lingered on the knife in Xiaoxian's hand for a few seconds. He had seen Xiaoxian's knife when he first woke up. Although the workmanship was rough, he had to admit that it was a good knife. However, he had never seen the material. If he wasn't in a hurry to find his companions, he would definitely ask more about the knife. Even now, his gaze lingered on the knife for a few more seconds. Shifting his gaze away from the knife, Gongjia Run looked at the sand. There was a skeleton. It was the sand lizard they killed together. It's still here. Gongjia Run was even more worried. If there were no accidents, those people would not have given up on the sand lizard. In other words, the 5 of them had encountered something else and failed to hide the sand lizard. The sand lizard had been gnawed by other desert animals until only its skeleton was left. The movement of sand in the desert was easy to cover their tracks. Moreover, 2 days had passed. Even the crater created by Sapphire's slaughter of the sand lizard had been filled up. They could not find any more traces to follow. What do we do? Ta looked at Xiaoxian. We can only use the old method. Get Sapphire to look for them. Insects had a stronger sense of smell than humans. Insects could smell things that humans could not. Although Sapphire was not as good as flying insects that specialized in tracking, it was better than nothing. Gong Jiaren was about to say something when he felt a tremor. Sapphire was smashing the ground with its forelimbs. Thud, thud, thud. It was not the kind of unbridled murderous smashing that was full of killing intent when hunting sand lizards. Instead, it was more like sending out a kind of signal with a regular pattern. When smashing down, it controlled the angle and did not raise a large amount of sand and dust. What is it doing? Gong Jiaren was puzzled. Did beetles use this method to find people? He had never heard of this before. It's just happy, said Xiaoxian as he looked at Sapphire's hind legs kicking the sand. When Sapphire was happy, it would kick its hind legs like kicking a ball. Xiaoxian knew this very well. Happy? What is it happy about? It was not just Gong Jiaren. The others did not understand either. Xiaoxian did not explain further. Instead, he pointed downwards. Look at the ground. The ground? What was on the ground? Everyone looked downwards. Other than sand, there was still sand. Something's not right, Tao exclaimed suddenly. An inexplicable sense of danger rose in him, as if a chill had brushed past his back. Goosebumps broke out all over Tao's body. People with rich hunting experience and strong intuition all had the same feeling. Their surroundings were silent. Other than the soft sound of the wind rustling the sand, there were no other sounds. It was as if all living creatures had left. Lying on the beetle's back, Gong Jiaren shuddered inexplicably. Although the scorching sun was scorching the beetle's back, he could still feel a chill seeping out of his bones. In terms of intuition, he was not as good as the Yinjiao, but after surviving in the desert for so many days, he could more or less react. They stared unblinkingly at the sand, waiting to see what was underneath. Rustle, 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 there were some soft sounds. Every movement was not loud, but there were many places, as if something was rushing out from underground. Rustle, rustle, rustle. It was getting closer. A dot of black emerged from the yellow sand. Then 2 dots of black, 3 dots, 4 dots, 10 dots, 100 dots, 1,000 dots. The densely packed black dots covered the original yellow sand. Gong Jiaren took a deep breath, his voice trembling as he looked at the scene before him. This is an insect swarm. This was one of the legendary desert disasters, the insect swarm. More and more black beetles emerged, and it was not stopping. Not a speck of yellow sand could be seen nearby. In the distance, the sand was gradually being eroded by the black. More and more beetles gathered around the giant beetle. Gong Jiaren, who was lying on Sapphire's back, felt the most keenly. He did not even have the strength to sit up, beads of sweat dripping from his forehead. Most of the Yinjiao people had encountered similar situations before. Back when they came to the desert to fetch people from the coast, they had encountered insect swarm as well. That was why they knew that as long as Sapphire was around, the insect swarm would not be a threat to them. The bad feeling was purely a conditioned response to danger. Insect swarms were harder to deal with than fearsome beasts. Plus, they felt that these insects were even more dangerous this time. Gong Jiaren looked around nervously, but realized that other than a few people, most of the Yinjiao people were calm. There was no fear or caution in their eyes. Instead, there was interest. Gong Jiaren snapped out of his daze and understood. He was lying on the giant beetle's back. And now, these little beetles that had appeared were in cahoots with this big beetle. They might even be obeying this big beetle. So it was a false alarm. Gong Jiaren let out a long sigh of relief. However, halfway through his exhalation, he suddenly remembered that his companions wouldn't have been eaten by the insect swarm. Would they? Not long after emerging, the little beetles burrowed back into the sand. They did not like to move above the sand during the day, especially when the sun was shining brightly. When all the little beetles had burrowed back into the sand, Gong Jiaren asked, "Could my companions have encountered an insect swarm here?" "No," said Xiaoxian confidently. Indeed, if Gong Jiaren's companions had encountered an insect swarm, with their current abilities, there was no way they could escape. They would only be eaten. However, there were no human skeletons here. Even if the beetles had eaten all the bones, why was the sand lizard's skeleton still there? Hence, the only explanation was that the 5 of them did not encounter an insect swarm. Since they did not encounter an insect swarm, they must have left for some other reason. Xiaoxian instructed Sapphire to track them down. It could find people based on their scent. Hence, the giant blue beetle circled the sand a few times before heading in a certain direction. Follow it. Xiaoxian gestured for the rest to follow. After chasing for a while, Xiaoxian took out his universal eye. That direction is not towards Rock Hill City. If we go that way, we'll probably encounter desert bandits. They won't be heading towards the desert bandits, unless they have no choice. Gong Jiaren's heart sank. This was not good news. Could they have joined the desert bandits? It was not impossible to find support in a desperate situation. Just like when they first entered the desert, some of their team members had done so. However, Gong Jiaren believed that the 5 of them were forced to do so. They were taken away by the desert bandits, not joining the desert bandits. No matter what the truth was, they would find the answer if they continued searching. Initially, Gong Jiaren was worried that the Yinjiao people would choose not to join the desert bandits because they did not want to provoke them. However, halfway through, he heard the Yinjiao people talking about robbing the desert bandits and swallowed his words. When he thought about the giant beetle beneath him, then about the insect swarm that might be following them under the sand, Gong Jiarun was suddenly not afraid. Chapter 741. There are many bandit groups in the desert, big and small, scattered around the desert borders. They didn't dare to get too close to the center of the desert, as they were afraid of the people from Rock Hill City and the legendary undying monsters. Xiao Xian and the rest followed Sapphire in a certain direction. They had already walked so far, and they were heading towards the area with the most bandit groups. They were sure that the 5 of them went to the bandit group, but they didn't know if they were forced or not. In that direction, there were indeed desert bandits. However, if they continued to walk in that direction, they would leave the desert and see lakes, forests, and tall mountains. However, none of the desert bandits went there, because there were many ferocious beasts that they couldn't fight against. The beasts in the desert would often go there to drink water. During the breeding season, the fighting was even more intense. Only the strong in the food chain could survive there. The bandits didn't have the ability to go there yet. Xiao Xian knew about the situation there, because past the mountain range, they were very close to the grasslands and the Hui tribe. The reason why the Hui tribe was able to capture a monster and bring it back was because they were closer to the desert. However, if it weren't for special circumstances, they wouldn't go through the mountain range. Although it's a short journey, it's troublesome. In the past, they would take the longer route to the desert, and it would take a longer time, but it was safer. While he was deep in thought, Xiao Xian recalled the general situation. The desert bandits were forced to the border and had nowhere else to go. If they retreated further, they would have to fight with the beasts. However, any force that could survive Rock Hill City's purge was not to be underestimated. Although many people said that the bandits were mostly built by the slave masters, compared to Wu Yan, the group formed by the slaves was more dangerous. The leaders of the slaves who could truly establish a powerful organization and survive the chaos of the desert were likely to be those who had already broken free from their shackles. To be able to break free from the slave master's enslavement and break free from their shackles, every one of them was extremely talented and had a strong temperament. They were even more terrifying than the slave masters. Xiao Xian even dared to say that in a few decades, the scattered forces in the desert would disappear or be gathered together. Among the last remaining forces, the slaves would definitely establish more forces than the slave masters. However, in the current situation, whether it's the slaves or the slave masters, they aren't easy to talk to. At this time, at the edge of the desert, there was a small city made of sand and stones. It was not a big city. Compared to the several big cities in the desert, it was not even 1/10 the size. At most, it could only be regarded as a place to gather and shelter people from the wind and rain. The people in this town have dark brown patterns on their bodies, like snakes coiling around their bodies. They are known as the sand snakes. The Sand Snakes are one of the more famous bandit groups. The leader of this group is a man named He Sha. He used to be a slave, but during the chaos of the desert, he escaped with a group of slaves and broke free from his shackles. He then built the Sand Snakes at the edge of the desert. Outside the small town, a group of nearly 100 people approached. They were stopped at the gate of the small town. The group left their camels outside and left a few people to take care of the camels. The leader led the others into the small town. These people didn't belong to this town or the Sand Snakes. They belonged to another bandit group, the Blue Beetle. The Blue Beetle is one of the more unique groups among the bandit groups. They were also one of the earliest groups to be established. When many people were fleeing, they found a place with a well. When everyone else was using rocks as weapons, they were already using gold. Rumors say that the Blue Beetle has a slave master supporting them. However, after a few years, those who know the Blue Beetle know that there is no slave master in the group. The leader is also a slave named Yiken who broke free from his shackles. Probably because they rose too early, they gained the upper hand. By the time the bandit groups started to develop, the Blue Beetle had already gained a firm foothold and recruited many people. Now the Blue Beetle is one of the more famous bandit groups. They're not any weaker than the Sand Snakes. However, compared to other groups, the Blue Beetle name wasn't as domineering. Other groups had names with words like snake, scorpion, vulture, knife, axe, and so on. The Blue Beetle, on the other hand, took on an insect name. Even their symbol looked ridiculous. They were no longer tribesmen. However, if they wanted to rebuild their tribe, a symbol full of meaning was necessary. A symbol signified faith. It was a spiritual sustenance in a difficult situation. It also signified the beginning of a new life, similar to the tribesman's totem. Therefore, they tried their best to use powerful species as symbols for their groups. For example, the sand snake's symbol was a desert viper. A tiny drop of its venom was enough to kill people. It was feared. As for the blue beetle, their symbol was a blue bug. The blue beetle was probably the only bandit group that used a bug as a symbol. Although many mocked them in private, they didn't understand why they would use such a symbol. The blue beetle leader must be out of his mind to come up with such a symbol. However, in front of the blue beetle members, no one dared to mock them. Otherwise, a bloody battle would ensue. Among these people, other than the leader, the others had yet to break free from their shackles. After all, not everyone could reach that step. After all, there were only a few people who had the talent, strength, and temperament. Now these people had already established their own forces. After being slaves for so long, once they saw a glimmer of hope, they would have thoughts of rebellion. They no longer wanted to be slaves. They no longer wanted to be ordered around and trampled on by others. They wanted to control their own futures. This time the blue beetle leader, Yiken, was at the forefront. He was here to negotiate with Black Sand. Yiken was very tanned. Most of the slaves in the desert were like that. He didn't look very strong, and his body was lean. Standing opposite him was the sand snake's leader, Black Sand. His body was covered in firm muscles. Under his tanned skin, he looked like an iron tower. His naked upper body was surrounded by black vipers. His entire being exuded a dangerous and oppressive aura. Long time no see, Yiken. Black Sand strode over. Although there was a smile on his face, his eyes were gloomy. He didn't look like he was in a good mood. Yiken, on the other hand, acted as if he didn't see his expression. He maintained his pace, and his tone was calm and distant. Long time no see, Black Sand. Both of them raised their palms and clapped in the air. Their eyes met, filled with wariness. Black Sand's gaze swept across Yiken. On Yiken's exposed arms was an inverted beetle. Above the beetle was a round ball. Chapter 742. This time, the blue beetles were here mainly for an important resource. A few days ago, the blue beetles and the vipers had their eyes on a place. That place was the stronghold of another desert bandit group. There was a hidden underground spring there. Although they could not see anything from the surface, they received news that there was an underground palace built by a slave master in secret. Many slave masters liked to build underground palaces. However, there were not many suitable places in the desert to build underground palaces. so there were very few underground palaces. After the slave master built the underground palace, he discovered that there was water seeping through somewhere in the palace. Finally, he discovered that there was an underground spring there. Although the underground spring was not big, it was a precious resource in a place like this where there was a shortage of water. After all, not every underground palace could encounter such a thing. It was no doubt a pleasant surprise to encounter such a thing. However, the slave master did not spread the news. Instead, he executed all the slaves who discovered the spring and kept it a secret for himself. He even sealed the underground palace and treated it as a hidden treasure that belonged to him. Later, due to the changes in the desert, the slave master escaped to the underground palace with his people. He planned to use it as a temporary stronghold to develop his power. However, his slaves betrayed him. One of them broke through his shackles and escaped his control. The slave master was killed, and the underground palace was seized by the slave who broke through his shackles. He gathered some of the escaped slaves, and eventually developed into a desert bandit group, Tianshui. Tianshui was another name for rain in the desert. Therefore, when people heard the name Tianshui, they did not think too much about it. The desert people's desire for rain was well known. No one found it strange that a desert bandit group would choose such a name. However, many people did not know that they actually wanted to use the name Underground Spring, because the spring below the underground palace was their source of life. It was their hope. However, that would be too straightforward. If they said it out loud, people would be able to guess what was below. They were not that stupid. Therefore, they chose the opposite of earth, sky. Tianshui's power also developed quickly. However, the secret was not kept for long. The desert bandits that were gathered were not united. Even if the secret was only known by a few leaders of Tianshui, it was made known to everyone because of an internal conflict. Slowly, other desert bandit groups found out about it through some means. Blue Beetle and Viper were just two of them. There were many more who had their eyes on that place. Not long ago, Black Sand had approached Yiken with the intention of working together to take down the Skywater Underground Palace. If they were to go alone, even if they managed to take down the palace, they wouldn't be able to hold it for long. Bloody battles between desert bandit groups were always filled with casualties. It would consume too much energy, and it wasn't worth it. After careful consideration, Yiken decided to give it a try. The place they used to live in was no longer suitable. The spring there was shrinking, and would probably disappear in the near future. The Blue Beetle was now growing stronger. As the leader, Yiken had to think for the future. His ambitions weren't limited to this. Therefore, Yiken brought his men here to negotiate with Black Sand. The trust level between desert bandit groups wasn't high. If they wanted to work together, they had to first discuss the distribution of resources. If they couldn't come to an agreement, there was no need for cooperation. The two bandit leaders walked into a stone house made of sand and stone. This was the heart of the small town, and it was also the most luxurious house in the town. Most of the houses in other parts of the town were made of sand and stone. Even if they were made of sand and stone, there weren't many stones. However, stones were the main building material here. It looked sturdier and taller than other houses. The only one who could live here was Black Sand, the leader of the desert bandit group. Although it couldn't compare to the slave master's place, Black Sand was still satisfied to have his own mansion. He also believed that he could build an even more luxurious palace in the future, just like the slave masters in the past. Black Sand led Yiken into the house. The two leaders had a discussion, but the others didn't enter. It involved some secrets that they didn't want others to know. With Tianshui as an example, even if they were from the same gang, they couldn't fully trust each other. Therefore, Black Sand suggested that only the two leaders would talk in private, while the others waited outside. Yiken didn't object to this. However, after entering the house, to Yiken's surprise, Black Sand didn't bring up the topic of cooperation immediately. Instead, he talked about something else. "A few days ago, we the Vipers added a newcomer," said Black Sand. Yiken looked at Black Sand, waiting for him to continue. It was common for newcomers to join a desert bandit group. It wasn't unusual, but Black Sand must have brought it up for a reason. "He's from that side," Black sand pointed in a direction. Yiken understood. It seemed that the newcomer came from the other side of the sea. The desert bandits liked to rob people from the other side of the sea. Firstly, people from other tribes wouldn't step into the desert. Only people from the other side of the sea would come here. Secondly, people from the other side of the sea always brought along many unique items such as gold wares, more exquisite clothing and so on. They liked to rob these people. The newcomer, in order to seek protection, gave me this to show his sincerity. Black sand pulled out a golden sword from behind the stone chair. There were some words on the sword that they couldn't understand, but that didn't stop them from admiring the patterns. The patterns engraved on the sword looked mysterious, accentuating the preciousness and rarity of the sword. Black sand turned the hilt and swept his gaze over to Yiken. Then, he gripped the hilt tightly and slashed downwards. The blade sliced through the air with a sharp whistling sound. Then it hit a rock beside him. With a crisp sound, the rock that was the size of a human head split into two. Yiken's pupils contracted and his body tensed up. He knew that black sand was showing off and intimidating them at the same time. A good weapon was also a great help. These people who were once slaves and later broke through their shackles were actually not that far off in terms of strength now. Otherwise, they would not have been in a situation where there was a balance of forces instead of directly annexing them. The weapons they usually used couldn't compare to this sword at all. Because of this sword, the two men who were originally evenly matched began to lean towards one side. However, after Black Sand slashed the sword, he returned it to the chair. His goal had been achieved. He believed that the next negotiation would be easier. He didn't plan to attack the blue beetle directly. He didn't have absolute confidence in killing Yiken, even if he had this legendary sword. Moreover, in order to take down Sky Water's underground palace, he still needed to cooperate with the blue beetle. The purpose of intimidating them earlier was just to gain more benefits during the negotiation. While the leaders of the two major desert robber organizations were secretly discussing their cooperation, in another part of the small town, a place where captives were kept, there were a few people locked up in a low sandy house. These people were either captured during a battle or robbed. There were several types of captives here. The first type were those who were important and were temporarily locked up here to await the leader's follow-up decision. For example, the 5 captives who were captured yesterday. The other type were those who were useless. These people were locked up here and wouldn't receive any food. At most, they would be given some water mixed with sand to ensure that they wouldn't die immediately. However, these people wouldn't be locked up here for long. They would be brought out soon and become food for the desert robbers. There wasn't much to eat in the desert, so humans became food too. To the slaves, irrelevant people were no different from other beasts. Therefore, they would eat them when they were hungry. There was no psychological pressure, and it was even natural for the desert robbers. One of the vipers who was guarding there was sitting in the shade, avoiding Yang Guang's exposure to the sun. He yawned and glanced around occasionally, listening to the movements of the people in the house. After another yawn, the man felt that something seemed to be moving under his feet. There were often some small beasts in the desert, and they were used to this situation. Therefore, the man calmly moved his feet away and took out his dagger, intending to see what was below. It would be good if it was edible. The thing under the sand was getting closer and closer. The man raised the dagger in his hand, waiting for the right time to stab down. However, the thing under the sand seemed to have sensed the danger on the ground. Just as it was about to climb out of the sand, it turned and went in the other direction. Not wanting to give up on the possible food in front of him, the man got up and chased after it. Anyway, there were other people guarding here, and it wouldn't be a big deal if he left for a while. After the man left, the sand on the sand bulged, and a dozen black beetles the size of a palm drilled out from the ground. Behind them, Xiao Xian pushed the sand aside and drilled out from under the sand. Chapter 743. Sapphire was enslaved by Xiao Xian, so its aura was similar to Xiao Xian's. After all, its power came from Xiao Xian, and it was Sapphire's power that attracted the beetles. Others might not be able to tell the difference, but the little beetles could. They would not harm Xiao Xian. In fact, Xiao Xian could even order them to do certain things. These slightly larger beetles had led the swarm of beetles to hunt for food while Sapphire was asleep. Compared to the other beetles, they were not only different in size, but also stronger and smarter. However, no matter how smart they were only similar to regular beasts. Even Sapphire could not make them carry out complicated orders. However, simple orders were still possible. For example, luring the guards away, or leading the other beetles to dig a hole in the sand. Xiao Xian and the rest had followed Sapphire all the way to this small town, because most of the land around the town was flat, and there was nowhere to hide. Their goal was to save people, not to fight the desert bandits. Even if they had to fight, they had to save the people first. Hence, they came up with another plan. Sapphire brought Xiao Xian underground. Due to Sapphire's large size, it would easily alert the desert bandits. That was why Sapphire only brought Xiao Xian underground for a short while, and left the rest of the task to the other beetles. They had the experience of walking under a quagmire. It was more difficult to walk under sand, but it was not impossible. Plus, they had the help of the beetles underground. There were more beetles underground that had yet to emerge. Sapphire could determine the approximate location of the 5 Gongjia family members. Xiao Xian only came out to sense their exact location. He had a beetle lure a guard away before emerging from the sand. There was a guard on each side of the house. The guard on this side had been lured away. It was no wonder the beetles liked to be underground. During the day, the temperature was much lower under the sand, and they did not need to be exposed to the sun. This was a courtyard structure. There were some scattered bones in the corner of the courtyard. Xiao Xian could tell from the shape of the bones that they belonged to humans, both adults and children. The house and courtyard walls were relatively short, so if Xiao Xian walked outside, the people in the courtyard could see half of his head. Similarly, if Xiao Xian stood up straight in the courtyard, he would be seen by the people outside. There were about 10 people sitting outside the courtyard, leaning against the wall. They were all gathered in the shade. Xiao Xian did not fully emerge from the sand, only exposing his upper body. He carefully sensed his surroundings to understand where the guards were, and search for his target. The 5 Gongjia family members' auras were different from the other captives. Xiao was certain where they were locked up. Unfortunately, they were not on this side, but it was fine. The beetles that crawled out from the ground gathered again, and burrowed into the sand. Xiao Xian took a deep breath and sank into the sand. Not long after Xiao Xian sank, the guard who left returned. He did not manage to catch the thing underground, so he walked over, cursing as he sat down and continued to nap. On the other side, in a mud hut, the 5 Gongjia family members were tied up tightly using the sturdy vines of the desert. These vines may look shriveled and thin, but they were very sturdy. Other than injuries, the 5 of them were thirsty and hungry. They were weak and had no energy to struggle. They laid on the ground, surrounded by mud walls and sand. Their eyes were either open or closed, but they were not asleep. No one knew what they were thinking. That day, they did not manage to find Gongjia Run. Not long after, they encountered a group of desert bandits, one of whom was their former comrade. Their comrade led the desert bandits to capture them, and only gave them some water, so they would not die immediately. The Vipers wanted them to forge weapons for the Vipers, but they refused and were locked up here. Yesterday, they had witnessed the desert bandits eating humans. They knew that the desert bandits had done it on purpose for them to see, but they also knew that the desert bandits were real. They had long heard that tribesmen ate humans, and that the people here were barbaric. However, seeing it with their own eyes was still a huge shock. Even now they were still traumatized. If they agreed to forge weapons for the desert bandits, they would be able to live like slaves. Judging by the Vipers' behavior, it did not seem like they would treat them kindly. However, if they did not agree, they would become food for the desert bandits. What should they do? Should they choose to live or die? I really want to kill myself, mumbled the younger man leaning against the wall with his head lowered. That's a good idea, but I can't accept it. Another older man looked up at the leaking roof and sighed helplessly. Yes, they had all thought of suicide, but they still had some hope. Perhaps there would be a turning point. At the end of the day, they just could not accept it. No one would be willing to die in the desert just like that before they could create a masterpiece. If not, how could they have persevered until now? If we didn't choose to come here. One of them smiled bitterly and fell silent. There were no ifs in this world. They had chosen this path, so they had to bear the consequences. Previously, they had thought of digging their way out of the sand, but later they realized that it was too difficult. With their current physical strength, it was impossible to dig their way out of the sand, not to mention that their hands and feet were tied up. The desert bandits were also aware of their situation, which was why they were at ease tying them up and leaving them here. Rustle, rustle, rustle. There was the sound of tiny grains of sand rubbing against each other. Xiao Yi stopped playing with sand. It's annoying, complained a man with his eyes closed in the corner. The young man leaning against the wall looked up blankly. I'm not playing with sand. After saying that, he shifted his gaze to the place where the sound came from. He saw that the sand on the ground moved, and a black beetle crawled out. There's a bug, cried Gongjiayi loudly. The man standing guard outside heard it too, but he did not care. He continued to nap. There were plenty of bugs in the desert. Scorpions and lizards were common too. A small bug was nothing. Inside the house, 10 palm-sized beetles crawled out, but did not approach the people inside. Instead, they waited by the side. A hand reached out from the sand. Seeing this scene, the 5 people sucked in a breath of cold air and almost cried out. They looked at the spot where the beetles crawled out, and saw a person slowly crawling out from the sand. The 5 of them stared blankly at this strange stranger. When they snapped back to reality, their first thought was, could they be saved? Xiao Xian looked at the 5 people in the house, and was satisfied. They were not stupid enough to not scream. One of them asked in a low voice, Who are you? Are you here to save us? Xiao Xian did not answer. Instead he asked, Gongjiayi Shi Rong Shun Kan? These were their names, told to him by Gongjiarun. At Xiao Xian's words, the 5 people's eyes lit up. They were about to say something when Xiao Xian raised his hand, and gestured for them to keep their voices down. The 5 of them nodded quickly, their eyes shining even brighter. Xiao Xian took out a piece of cloth and opened it under the light. There were words written by Gongjiarun on it. The purpose was to tell the 5 people that Xiao Xian was here to save them, to make them believe in Xiao Xian. With the light from above, the 5 of them could read the words on the cloth clearly. They were so excited they wanted to cry. This person could get out from under the sand. Could he get them out from under the sand too? At this thought, the 5 of them suddenly felt that this person was reliable. They looked forward to Xiao Xian's next move. This was not the time to talk too much. The more they spoke, the higher the chance of them being discovered. That was why they just had to believe in Xiao Xian. With Gongjiarun's cloth, they did not have to suspect anything. Xiao Xian walked towards the nearest person and cut off his vines. He waved at the others, gesturing for them to come closer. The 5 of them were overjoyed. But soon, they felt that the development of the situation was different from what they had imagined. Wait, I understand the logic, but brother, why did you untie us and tie us up? Yes, after Xiao Xian untied the vines, he connected the vines together to tie them up. Not only that, he used his own rope to reinforce the vines, so that none of them would fall off easily. The 5 of them looked at Xiao Xian in confusion, not understanding Xiao Xian's intentions. Xiao Xian wanted to ask the beetles to help transport the 5 of them out. However, the beetles would not eat Xiao Xian, but the same could not be said for the others. Sapphire had been in hibernation for a long time, and had just encountered a swarm of beetles. He did not know if it could control these insects accurately. That was why there was no need to take such a risk, when there was another way. Xiao Xian did not want the 5 of them to be reduced to skeletons when they were dragged out from under the sand. After tying them up, Xiao Xian gave Sapphire, who was underground outside the small town, an order to execute the next step. 100 meters away from the small town, a gush of sand suddenly shot out. The sand shot up high like a water column, then fell back down. That was a signal. Xiao Xian looked at the sky through the gap in the roof. When he saw the figure high in the sky, he sank back into the sand, leaving the 5 tied-up people in the house looking at each other. Not long after, there was a sudden scream from somewhere outside. It seemed that something had happened there. The guards rushed over. Xiao Xian appeared in the house again. He lifted the 5 tied-up people and cut open the place where they were tied up on the door made of thorny plants. In order to make it easier for the desert bandits to enter and exit the house, the door was wide enough for Xiao Xian to drag the 5 of them out. The guards were attracted by the shouts, and even the guards outside the courtyard turned their attention over there. Therefore, there was no one else at the door of the house. The 5 of them still did not understand what Xiao Xian was trying to do until Xiao Xian lifted them up and threw them into the air like a ball. The ground quickly moved away, and the small courtyard where the captives were held shrank in their vision. The 5 of them felt as if their heartbeats had stopped, and their minds were blank for a moment. Above them, a figure whizzed past, and the 5 tied-up people were carried away into the distance. Chapter 744. The guards who were guarding the captives ran over when they heard a scream. When they saw one of their comrades sunk into the sand from the head down, they rushed over to check on the situation. Who would have thought that something would happen in such a short time? The guards screamed as they rushed to the captives' room. The room where the 5 important figures were locked up was empty. The captives escaped. Someone's snatching the captives. Go after them. They're too fast, we can't catch up. The 5 captives we caught yesterday have been taken away. Quick, inform the chief. Xiao Xian had already sunk into the sand before those people arrived. However, he did not leave. He planned to stay here and observe. After he snuck in, he heard the guards outside talking about the Viper and the Blue Beetle leaders. He wanted to see what these desert bandits were up to. At the same time, he wanted to find out where the person who betrayed Gong Jiarun was. Before Xiao Xian arrived, Gong Jiarun had told Xiao Xian that if he saw the traitor, he should kill him immediately. That way, Gong Jiarun would owe Xiao Xian a favor. As for the sword, Gong Jiarun did not insist. He planned to start anew, and believed that he would be able to forge a better sword in the future. As for the previous one, since it was stolen, he did not want to take it back. It was a farewell to the past. The Yinjia people did not understand Gong Jiarun's feelings. If they lost a good sword, they would definitely think of ways to get it back. There was no such thing as a mood, a new beginning or an old one. However, since Gong Jiarun did not ask for it, Xiao Xian did not pay too much attention to it. On the other hand, after hearing the report, the atmosphere between the 2 chiefs had turned sour. After hearing the news, Black Sand's gloomy face turned ferocious. He glared at Yiken. You cheated. Black Sand's eyes were suddenly bloodshot, as if they were dyed red. This happened every time he used the power in his body, after breaking through the shackles. When he heard the news, Yiken cursed internally. Now that he saw Black Sand in this state, he knew that this discussion could not continue. We didn't do it. Yiken distanced himself from Black Sand and tried his best to explain. He was not stupid. It was not a good thing to fall out with the Sand Snake now. Moreover, he did not know who was being held captive by the Black Sand tribe. It seemed that the Black Sand tribe valued this person. Regardless of anything else, he would not admit to this. Unfortunately, Black Sand refused to listen or believe him. Other than the Blue Beetles, there was no one else here. Furthermore, he had always been wary of the Blue Beetles. When he first heard the news, he suspected that Yiken had already sent people to kidnap those who could forge better weapons. Now, Yiken was playing dumb in front of him. How preposterous! How dare he trick him? I want you all dead. Black Sand swung his thick arm. A sharpened bone spear flew out from his hand and shot straight at Yiken. Yiken, who was prepared for this, swung his sword horizontally in front of him, deflecting the bone spurs that were flying towards him. He roared, I told you it wasn't us. Meeting Black Sand's bloodshot eyes, Yiken's heart skipped a beat. This was probably the aftereffect of breaking through the shackles. Everyone's symptoms were different. Black Sand's was easily irritable. The most obvious sign of this was his bloodshot eyes. Black Sand was already in a berserk state. He wouldn't listen no matter what was said. Moreover, the relationship between the 2 parties was not harmonious to begin with. The discussion just now was not a pleasant one, which further provoked Black Sand's anger. Without another word, Yiken leaped up and rushed out of the room, through the animal skin scale that was used as a cover. He let out a wolf-like howl towards the sky. He was telling his subordinates that the negotiation had failed. Everyone be careful. The Blue Beetle desert robbers who were waiting outside gathered around Yiken. They pulled out their weapons and faced the sand snake people who were surrounding them. Bang! The rare wooden door in the desert was kicked to pieces. Black Sand walked out like a tall tower. Every step he took on the sand creaked loudly, as if he wanted to crush the sand even more. The murderous aura emanating from him swept out in all directions. Even the sand snakes couldn't help but take 2 steps back. How dare you trick me? Black Sand squeezed the words out from between his teeth. The air he exhaled from his nostrils made him sound like an angry bull. I told you we didn't do it, idiot. Use your brain and think. After Yiken said that, he realized that it was useless to tell Black Sand this. For Black Sand to be able to lead the sand snakes to this point meant that he wasn't a reckless man. Perhaps Black Sand now understood that it wasn't the Blue Beetle who kidnapped those people. He was just venting his anger on the Blue Beetle people. He even wanted to use force to force Yiken to continue the negotiation that failed to reach an agreement earlier. While the two parties were in a tense standoff, none of them noticed that a figure had sneaked into Black Sand's mansion. The figure sat by the window and watched everything outside. Xiaoxian was very interested in the Blue Beetle desert robber group. The pattern on their bodies was a beetle pushing a dung ball. How did they think of using this as a symbol? Blue Beetle? In the desert, most of the beetles were black in color. Even if they were interested in the dung-pushing beetle, they should be called black beetles. Why would they be called blue beetles? Could it be that they've seen sapphires before? Regardless of the truth, the Blue Beetle people weren't in a good situation. Walking out of the house, Black Sand's muscles squirmed and his bones creaked. It wasn't the sound of breaking, but every bone in his body was preparing for the upcoming battle. Wielding his sword, Black Sand took a few large strides towards Yiken. He raised his arm high and twisted his wrist that was gripping the hilt of his sword. The golden light reflected off the blade bloomed with murderous intent as it slashed towards Yiken at lightning speed. With the sound of metal clashing, the sword in Yiken's hand broke. People on the other side of the sea liked to use swords. After the robberies, the desert robbers were now using swords as their weapon of choice. This was especially true for leaders like Yiken. Most of them used swords. But now, the weapon in his hand, which he once thought to be a great weapon, had broken so cleanly. Without looking at the broken sword, Yiken's body was like a fully drawn bow. His ankle twisted on the sand, and his body borrowed the force to take 3 steps back. Each step was more than 2 meters away, avoiding Black Sand's second slash. At the same time, he reached behind him and pulled out a spearhead. This was the weapon he used in his early days. However, the handle of the spear was broken, and he had a new weapon. After polishing the spearhead, he carried it with him and used it as a dagger. The elders in the team said that it would bless him to return safely every time. Now Yiken wasn't sure if he could return safely. Things had gone beyond his expectations. The sword in his opponent's hand made him wary. Since his second slash didn't hit anyone, Black Sand wasn't in a hurry to continue. He looked at the broken sword on the ground, and then at Yiken's ordinary-looking spearhead. He snickered, his crimson eyes filled with mockery and satisfaction. The spinning sword reflected Yang Guang's light at Yiken and the others. Even though it was just a reflection of light, it was enough to make the Blue Beetles' faces change. They had seen with their own eyes how the sword had broken their leader's weapon. Now that the reflected light shone on them, they felt even more pressured. It was as if the blade of a sword was scraping against their bodies. They were so nervous that their palms were sweating. I'll give you a choice. Black Sand's words were slow, but they carried an irrefutable authority. His bloodshot eyes stared straight at Yiken and the others. Over at Heavenly Water, do as I say. And if I refuse? Yiken asked. Then you'll have to die. No one can help you now. Black Sand raised his sword and used the tip to point at the patterns on Yiken and the others. The smile on his face made him look even more ferocious. His crimson eyes were filled with mockery. You can summon the insects on your body too. Let me tell you. Those insects, I'll stomp them to death if they come. I'll stomp on a pair if they come. I'll stomp on as many as they come. Xiao Xian, who was watching the situation unfold, heard this and said silently, "You can't spout nonsense." Black Sand gripped the glowing sword in his hand. He felt as if he had stepped onto the stairs leading to the holy gate. He had become stronger, and could trample on the opponents he disliked in the past. Yiken frowned. He was thinking of the best strategy to deal with the current situation. However, Black Sand wouldn't give him that much time to think. Rustle, rustle, rustle. The sound of sand sliding was exceptionally clear in such a stagnant atmosphere. A strange feeling suddenly rose in his heart. Black Sand stared at a certain spot behind Yiken and the others. His eyes widened, and the expression on his face seemed to crack. Bit by bit, his expression changed stiffly. The hand holding the sword trembled. The people around them sucked in their breaths too. Their mouths were agape, as if they had seen something horrifying and unbelievable. Yiken, who was guarding against Black Sand and didn't look behind him, quickly turned back. Not far behind them, a huge blue beetle crawled out from the sand. Chapter 745. Somewhere outside the town, behind a sand dune that wasn't too tall, was one of the dunes closest to the Viper's stronghold. There was nowhere to hide if they went any further. Here, Ta and the rest were waiting, keeping an eye on the town's movements. When they saw a burst of sand outside the town, they knew that Xiao Xian had seen them and was about to send them out. That was the signal they had agreed on earlier. The burst of sand came from Sapphire, who was waiting there. Cha-Cha in the sky flew towards the town when it saw the burst of sand. There weren't many large birds of prey in the desert. If Cha-Cha got too close to the group, it would expose their whereabouts. That was why, since they entered the desert, Cha-Cha had been moving freely most of the time. It did not get too close to the group, but it did not stray too far away, either, so Xiao Xian could find it in time. After Xiao Xian threw the 5 Gongjia family members out, Cha-Cha swooped down from the sky and took them away. When they flew out of the town, they did not fly towards where Gongjia Run and the rest were. Instead, they flew in a different direction. After shaking off the vipers who were chasing them, they turned back to meet up with Gongjia Run. Gongjia Run explained the situation of the Flaming Horn tribe to the 5 of them. Although his 5 companions were not in the best state of mind, they were still alive and had all their limbs intact. Given enough time to rest and eat, they would recover without any major problems. Gongjia Run was relieved. It seemed like the Flaming Horn tribe was more powerful than he expected. They had made the right choice. If they could leave safely, Gongjia Run would help Yinjiao forge weapons in return for Yinjiao's help. Now that they had saved their people, they had no more worries. If they encountered desert bandits again, the Yinjiao people would not have to worry about anything. They waited for Xiao Xian to return. However, after a while there was a commotion in the town. Xiao Xian did not appear immediately, nor did he send out a signal for help. What should we do? Tua looked at Ta. Should we go there? Although there were beetles, there were still quite a number of vipers. Xiao Xian alone might not be able to withstand the siege. Accidents were bound to happen. No, wait a little longer. Ta raised his hand to stop him. They hadn't received Xiao Xian's call for help. At the same time, something seemed to be wrong in the small town. Xiao Xian had said that he would send out a signal if there were any abnormalities. Since Xiao Xian did not do so, they continued to wait here. After all these years, Ta also knew that Xiao Xian was no longer the ignorant kid who followed behind the team. Xiao Xian definitely knew what to do. They didn't need to do too much. They just needed to follow the plan. Pay attention to your surroundings, Ta said to everyone. They were now in a place with more desert bandits, so they had to be careful at all times. On the other side, in the small city of the Vipers, under everyone's watchful eyes, the giant blue beetle emerged from the sand. Yellow sand slid off its blue carapace, making hissing sounds. Sapphire's back height might only be considered medium-sized among the desert beasts. However, its overall shape was slightly flat and oval, resembling a giant inverted spoon. There wasn't enough space to accommodate it. As the giant beetle gradually emerged from the sand, the low sand house on the ground also collapsed amidst a series of rumbling sounds. The door woven from desert vines also emitted a fragile creaking sound as it collapsed, breaking off one by one. The people standing around had long retreated when they noticed the situation. They distanced themselves from the giant beetle that had appeared out of nowhere. Generally speaking, desert beasts rarely appeared in this area. After all, there were more and more desert bandits stationed here. Desert beasts would be rarer in places with more people, unless it was a more powerful giant beast. Sapphire's appearance had been categorized as the latter type of beast in everyone's mind. Yiken had planned to take a quick glance behind him and continue watching Black Sand. He wanted to ambush Black Sand when he wasn't paying attention. It would be best if he could snatch the sword from Black Sand's hand. However, Yiken didn't expect to see such a scene when he turned around. He was so shocked that he forgot his initial plan of ambushing Black Sand. Be it the vipers or the blue beetles, they all stared at the pattern drawn on the blue beetle's body. They looked at the beetle on the pattern, then back at the one that had just appeared. Suddenly they felt incredulous. The vipers exclaimed, "This pattern is real." The blue beetles exclaimed, "This is real." Although every desert bandit group had their own pattern, it was only a wish, a symbol. They didn't treat it as real. Without faith, how could they believe in a pattern so easily? Take the vipers for example. If they were to encounter a venomous snake in the desert, their first thought would be to kill it. If such a giant venomous snake appeared before them, they would definitely wet their pants. That was how the blue beetles were feeling now. The earliest batch of blue beetles had experienced the events of their escape years ago. They knew why Yiken and the elders of the desert bandits decided on such a name. Back then, when the desert was in chaos, they escaped. If it wasn't for the blue beetle that scared off the pursuers, they would have been hacked to death long ago. Moreover, the giant blue beetle gave them a lot of good stuff. That was the beginning of the rise of the blue beetle desert bandits. As for those who joined the blue beetle desert bandits later on, although they had heard about it from others, very few of them actually believed it. Some of them thought that it was either fabricated or pure luck. Now, if those who told them the story of the blue beetle were here, they would have screamed, "You're lying. Didn't you say that the beetle was only as tall as a human? What's this thing that's here?" Recalling Black Sand's words, the blue beetles assumed that Yiken had summoned it to help. They no longer cared about the legend. Their gazes towards Yiken were filled with boundless reverence and confidence. So their leader still had a trick up his sleeve. Not only did he summon a giant blue beetle, it was even bigger than the one in the legends. On the other hand, the vipers were horrified. They didn't expect the blue beetles to be prepared. Even Black Sand thought the same. Yiken, who was equally shocked. Yiken, of course, noticed everyone's gaze on him. He was both shocked and afraid. He really didn't summon this one. He had seen a giant blue beetle before, but it wasn't this big. He didn't dare to think about it. If this giant beetle's appearance was a coincidence, and it attacked indiscriminately, would the blue beetle's desert bandits need to change their patterns in the future? The appearance of the giant blue beetle changed the atmosphere in an instant. It was like a piece of frozen ice that was suddenly thrown into boiling water, and cracks began to appear. The sudden change in the situation brought about the same change in everyone's mood. Just as the vipers and blue beetles were having mixed feelings, the giant blue beetle's entire body was revealed. Its shovel-like head turned slightly to scan its surroundings. Its gaze lingered on Yiken for a few seconds. Yiken's heart clenched. He knew better than anyone else what was going on. He was afraid that this giant beetle would attack them. However, Yiken soon noticed that the giant beetle had shifted its gaze to Black Sand, who was standing there with a sword in hand. Other than the sound of sand being blown by the wind, there was silence. Everyone was waiting for the giant beetle's reaction. Even though they noticed that the giant beetle's pattern was similar to the blue beetle's desert bandits, they were still suspicious. The next moment, the giant blue beetle moved. It lifted its forelimb that resembled a long scythe and slammed it down on the sand. Unlike the slamming it did when it was hunting the sand lizards, its forelimb was now more extended. Like a black lightning bolt that fell from the sky, it struck the sand diagonally. The burst of air was like an invisible flying arrow. It shot from the point of impact to a certain direction. Wherever it passed, the sand on the sand was pushed to the sides. Yiken stood still. He knew that he wasn't the target of this attack. He turned back to look at black sand. That was the true target of the giant blue beetle. This attack alone was enough to make Yiken heave a sigh of relief. Thank goodness the giant beetle wasn't attacking him. When the giant beetle appeared, black sand was already on guard. The moment the giant beetle lifted its claw, he was ready to dodge the arrow-like air current. The air current hit the stone house behind black sand with a loud bang. The entire stone house shook. Sand, stone chips, and rocks swooshed down. Fortunately, the sandstone house took a lot of effort to build, so it didn't collapse from this attack. However, if there were to be a few more attacks later on, there was no telling what would happen. Black Sand's heart ached for his mansion. He didn't want to fight here. Gritting his teeth, he stepped out quickly and headed to the other side. Sapphire had the same intention. Xiaoxian was still in the stone house. Sapphire regretted its decision to throw him out. No one noticed the two antennae on its head trembling. Due to its previous mistake of almost eating Xiaoxian's target, Sapphire wanted to do something to atone for its mistake. Hence, it put in more effort to focus on that target. As for the others, it didn't even spare them a glance. Swinging its 6 long legs vigorously, Sapphire chased after Black Sand. The sand kicked up by its long legs hit Black Sand painfully. Yiken stopped chasing after Black Sand. He had the blue beetles move away. Noticing some small beetles crawling out from the sand, he hurriedly said, "Don't attack the beetles on the ground. Move away, move away." The people from the blue beetles did as they were told, while the people from the vipers used a stone spear to stab the beetle under their feet into the sand. Soon there were 2, 3, 10 beetles, and even more beetles appearing around him. The man panicked. He screamed and clenched the stone spear in his hand, stabbing at the beetles on the ground. The more he stabbed, the more beetles there were. The surrounding beetles started to gather. Soon they were like a small mountain, pushing the man up. His head and eyes couldn't be seen. At first, they could still see the man waving his stone spear and hear his screams. However, as the beetles continued to increase, they couldn't see anything else, and his screams became softer. The black beetles were like a small wave, sweeping the man into it. When the black wave gradually receded, only a skeleton with tattered clothes was left. What little doubt they had was now shattered by this scene. Someone from the viper's side roared, "Insect swarm!" Like a ladle of water being poured into a burning pot of oil. It exploded with a bang. "Insect tide! The insect tide is here! Run!" The vipers couldn't care less about the blue beetles. If they encountered an insect tide in the desert, they would usually run away and stay far away. They didn't expect to encounter an insect tide in their lair. No, it was the blue beetles who brought the insect tide here. The blue beetles could trigger an insect tide. This realization made the vipers even more fearful. "Make them leave!" the vipers shouted at Yiken. Unfortunately, the viper's leader had been chased away by the giant beetle. The people here were no match for Yiken. A group attack. But there were still so many beetles around. They were all man-eaters. To run or not to run. They watched as Yiken beheaded the vipers one by one. The slain ones were quickly devoured by the beetles on the ground. Some of the blue beetles were bitten as well, but Yiken didn't need to say anything. They all gathered around Yiken, including those who were waiting outside the small town, and rushed over after hearing the commotion. They all gathered around Yiken. Yiken stared at the densely packed black beetles on the ground, his heart pounding. He wasn't the elders. The elders believed in the totem, and believed that the beetle would give them a chance to live a new life. Yiken, on the other hand, had always been skeptical. However, a team needed a spiritual pillar, so when discussing the totem and name, he listened to the elders' suggestions. He wasn't confident about these insects either. Seeing that everyone was coming towards him, Yiken could only brace himself and step forward. "Everyone, don't attack the beetles on the ground," Yiken warned again. The person who felt a bite on his leg was about to chop the beetle, but after hearing Yiken's warning, he could only shake his leg to shake the beetle off. To their surprise, the beetles ran away after taking a few steps towards them. They didn't come any closer. It worked. One of the blue beetles turned to look at Yiken. "Boss, this was summoned by you?" The legendary disaster in the desert had actually helped them so peacefully, and even helped them. This was unbelievable. They decided that they would repent properly when they returned. What if they were eaten by an insect tide in the future? Yiken was thinking the same thing, but he was still suspicious. They were slaves who had seen and experienced too much. He still couldn't believe everything that was happening before his eyes. Rumbling noises came from not far away. It was the battle between the giant blue beetle and black sand. They had no idea how it was going. You guys wait here. I'll go up and check on the situation over there. Yiken wanted to jump onto the roof of the sandstone house, but before his feet could leave the ground, someone grabbed onto him. No, no, no. Boss, I want to follow you. The person who grabbed onto Yiken's arm said anxiously. Yes, yes. Boss will follow you. The others beside him quickly chimed in. No need, I'll be fine alone. You guys wait here. Before Yiken could finish, the others wailed and clutched onto Yiken tightly. No. Boss, don't leave us. They wailed so pitifully that it was as if they would be eaten if Yiken left. But that was the truth. Once Yiken left, the beetles who had been driven crazy by their thirst for blood began to attack indiscriminately. The only thing they wouldn't attack was Yiken. As soon as Yiken jumped onto the roof, the little beetles that were wandering around shrank their encirclement and approached. Seeing this, the people below waved at Yiken. Boss, help! Some even jumped onto the roof. Yiken leaped down from the roof, and the approaching beetles retreated. This scene wasn't only witnessed by the blue beetles, but also the vipers. The beetles didn't eat Yiken, and seemed to be avoiding him on purpose. Realizing this, some of the vipers began to ponder. Life was the most important thing. One of the vipers ran towards Yiken, shouting as he ran. I'll join you. I'll join the blue beetles. With the first, there would be the second, the third. Although they were worried that their betrayal would anger Black Sand, their lives were more important. Those who followed the blue beetles now wouldn't be eaten by the insect swarm. Plus, Black Sand might not end well. That giant beetle wasn't easy to deal with. Seeing more and more vipers clamoring to join the blue beetles, the blue beetles turned to Yiken and waited for their leader to make the decision. They all knew that the vipers were forced by the insect swarm, but this wasn't a bad thing for the blue beetles. At least for the current situation, it was a good thing. Let's not talk about loyalty. Now the desert bandits were competing on who had more people. Yiken, who was surrounded by the crowd like a protective umbrella, was feeling rather complicated. Yiken was more surprised than anyone else. It was actually true. Could it be that the protection the elders mentioned was real? Sensing something, Yiken whipped his head around to look at the sandstone house. His gaze swept from the door to the few windows. There was no one else in sight, but plenty of black beetles were swarming in through the windows. Those who wanted to hide in the house changed their minds. Leader, what are you looking at? One of the blue beetles asked Yiken. Yiken shook his head. Nothing. He just felt like someone was watching them, but when he looked over, he didn't see anything. Xian, who was originally in the sandstone house, had already made his way to Sapphire. Bang! The sand on the sandy ground splashed up like a reverse waterfall. Black Sand gripped his sword tightly and sliced the oncoming sand waterfall. The sand rubbed against the blade, producing a piercing sound. It was like sharp gravel scraping against one's heart, piercing one's eardrums. Black Sand's meridians expanded. Ever since he broke free from his shackles, other than his physical body becoming stronger, every time he used the energy within his body, his strength would increase exponentially. It was like a totem warrior activating his totemic power. However, unlike a totem warrior, although he had seized the power for his own use, he hadn't fully absorbed it. Every time he used that power, his emotions would easily become irritable. Fortunately, he controlled himself and didn't lose his rationality. Although there were side effects, the increase in his strength was undeniable. Black Sand dodged the giant beetle's long claws. The muscles on his arms expanded again, increasing his strength. Black Sand's eyes turned blood red and bulged outwards as if they were about to bleed. He stared at the giant blue figure not far away. 10 fingers gripped the hilt of his sword tightly. His feet shook the ground, and he bent his legs into a squat. His arched back revealed his protruding vertebrae. His joints moved up and down continuously, emitting a series of creaking sounds. In the next moment, he charged towards the giant beetle like a cannonball. The strength of his muscles and bones mixed with the condensed energy within his body. The large beetle raised its two front limbs again, intending to use the sand waterfall to block the sword momentum. Just as its two long scythe-like legs were about to touch the sand, Heisha's legs suddenly rotated, and the sand was shoveled into the air. The twisting force caused his body to turn in an instant, dodging the sand waterfall. Meanwhile, Heisha himself appeared at the side of the large beetle, and his fierce killing intent rushed towards the large beetle. Black Sand knew that he couldn't win against the giant beetle in terms of strength. However, he didn't want to give up his territory and run away. He wanted to use the sword in his hand to cut down the giant beetle. However, every time he rushed over, he would be blocked by the giant beetle's sand waterfall. Therefore, he decided to change his strategy. The giant beetle's actions must be because it was afraid of the sword in his hand. Black Sand's confidence grew. His target was the giant beetle's head. Without its head, how could this giant beetle survive? It wasn't like those monsters created by Rock Hill City. Clang! The strong force collided, producing a crisp sound like metal clashing. The force of the vibration transmitted to the bones of the hand holding the sword, producing a cracking sound. Black Sand's two arms were also repelled by the brute force. Black Sand's pupils shrank. He didn't hit. His target was the giant beetle's head. However, when he struck, the beetle seemed to be prepared. It used its other two pairs of legs, and its body spun like a top. In an instant it turned at an angle. The part that was originally facing the blade changed from its head to its carapace. And the carapace was the toughest part of the beetle's body. The sword in Black Sand's hand actually only left a shallow mark on its back when the blade of the sword slashed at its back armor. After being repelled by the force of the rebound, Black Sand didn't have time to do anything. The carapace had already crashed into him. Bam! Black Sand was sent flying. The strength in his body was already unstable. With this collision, his chi and blood were in turmoil. He spat out a mouthful of blood. Blood also seeped out of his eyes. The failure of the surprise attack and the mark on the carapace had shaken Black Sand's confidence. After sending him flying, Sapphire's two hind legs kicked. Its body, which looked as cumbersome as an armored vehicle, moved forward rapidly on the sand. One of its forelimbs was already lashing out like a whip. Black Sand was still in the air and had yet to land. Without wings, he couldn't dodge even if he wanted to. He had no other choice but to raise his sword to block. Bam! The toothed forelimb swept across like a heavy axe. It shook off the obstruction in the air and slammed heavily on the sword. A powerful force followed Black Sand's hand that was holding the sword hilt and rushed straight to his arm. Crack! After his fingers were broken, the bones in his arm made a crisp cracking sound. Even the vertebrae on his back were exploding continuously, as if they couldn't hold on any longer. As for Black Sand himself, he was smashed into the sand by this blow. The resulting sand flow scattered like water splashes. Chapter 746. The power in Black Sand's body was in disarray. The arm holding the sword was weak, and he had no choice but to switch to another hand. Just as he got up, the giant beetle was already in front of him. It raised its two front limbs, and did not give Black Sand any time to breathe. Heisha felt his scalp go numb from the pressure brought about by the large beetle. Every muscle in his body was trembling, and there was no time for him to dodge. He could only raise his arm and place his sword horizontally in front of him, blocking the attack that was already in front of him. Bang! Black Sand was almost completely smashed into the sand. He could not hold his sword steadily. If it was not for the fact that his body was much stronger, anyone else would have been smashed to death. Even so, Black Sand was barely holding on. He did not even have time to breathe. Heisha smelled the scent of death. Previously, he thought that after breaking free from his shackles, he would no longer have such a feeling. But now he felt it. Fear flashed through his scarlet eyes that were oozing blood. He did not want to die. He still wanted to unify this scattered land of desert bandits. He even fantasized about one day taking over Rock Hill City's territory and controlling the entire desert. But now, he could only helplessly endure the fierce and murderous smashes again and again. Sapphire's attack was actually very simple. In the beginning, it did not know the strength of Black Sand's weapon, and tested it a few times. But once it confirmed Black Sand and the sword's capabilities, its attack method was very clear. Especially now, when Black Sand was weak, Sapphire did not slack off and did not hold back. There were no superfluous movements. It was simple and straightforward. It smashed again and again. After smashing into the sand, Sapphire would pull him up from the sand and smash him again. If one smash did not kill him, Sapphire would smash him a few more times. Just like when Sapphire was chasing after those sand lizards, Sapphire would fish you out first before hitting you again. Unless you were really nailed to death, Sapphire would not relax. This was because many times, when Sapphire thought that the prey did not have the strength to stand up, and was about to turn it into a ball, it would realize that the prey had escaped. In order to avoid such mistakes, Sapphire's two front limbs did not stop. Rumbling sounds came from the sand. Sand flowers bloomed and fell. Potholes appeared and were flattened. When Black Sand heard the sound of his bones breaking, his consciousness gradually blurred. He could no longer feel the pain in his body. He regretted his decision. He should not have forced the blue beetles into a corner. Otherwise, the blue beetles would not have summoned the giant beetle. Or perhaps, he should have fled the moment the giant beetle appeared. Even if he lost his territory and his subordinates, with his ability and the sword in his hand, he could quickly rebuild a new group of desert bandits in the desert. Even before his death, Black Sand believed that the giant blue beetle was summoned by Yiken. Sapphire finally stopped its attack. Its shovel-like head twitched, as if it was thinking of what to do with this person. Its two paddle-shaped antennae moved. It wanted to wrap the prey into a ball, but the prey was too small. It would only be a small ball even if it was wrapped into a ball. While Sapphire was hesitating, Xiaoxian gave it a command. In the end, Sapphire did not manage to turn the Black Sand into a ball. It extended its forelimbs to scoop up the object that had been smashed into the sand and left. After Sapphire left, a swarm of black beetles crawled out from the sand and swarmed towards the unrecognizable person. Heisha had eaten many people before. Even his blood relatives were not spared when he was still on the run. Men, women, the elderly, and children, he had eaten them all. However, he had never thought that he would be eaten by a group of insects one day. The Viper Man, who was huddled in a low sand house, saw the situation through the gap of the half-blocked vent. He shrunk into a corner of the house. He did not dare to go out. Even Black Sand had been eaten by the insects. He would not be able to escape their jaws. At this moment, there were more than 300 people surrounding Yiken. Those at the edge were too far away from Yiken and were bitten from time to time. However, they did not dare to attack the beetles. For one, they were afraid of being bitten harder. For another, they were worried that the blue beetles would kick them to the side to fend for themselves. The blue beetles had always swallowed their pride when they were bitten. There were even some who were fighting for a spot closer to the center. Yiken never knew that he was so popular. Even his own subordinates used to be afraid of him due to his strength. Now their fear was mixed with respect. He knew what these people were thinking, but he really did not summon the giant beetle, nor did he do anything else. It's retreating. The insect swarm is retreating. Someone shouted from the periphery. It's retreating. It's really retreating. More people were ecstatic. The Viper Man's first thought was their leader, Black Sand. Since the insect swarm had retreated, what happened to Black Sand? Did he win or lose the battle with the giant beetle? The black beetles that were lingering nearby either burrowed into the sand or left immediately. Earlier, there was a sea of darkness, but now, there was only sand left. There were also some collapsed sand houses nearby, and some gnawed skeletons. Some of the Viper Man took 2 tentative steps outside, but did not encounter any more black beetles. Leader, the insect swarm has retreated. Does that mean the giant beetle has left too? A blue beetle asked Yiken. Yiken pushed through the crowd in front of him and walked out. The others followed closely behind Yiken. Although they did not see the beetles, they were still worried. It was safest to stay by Yiken's side. Yiken paused and continued forward. He jumped onto the roof and peered into the distance. No, it's not. It's still here. Just as Yiken's words fell, the people who had walked far away retreated back. They refused to leave even after being threatened with knives by the blue beetles. The insect swarm hasn't retreated. It's just left and stopped nearby. It seems to be waiting for something. Yiken jumped off the roof and said, "The little beetles didn't leave." In other words, the giant blue beetle was still there. The giant blue beetle had left after Black Sand. Now that the sounds of fighting could no longer be heard, did Black Sand run away? Or was he killed by the giant blue beetle? No matter which of the two possibilities it was good news for Yiken. He grew increasingly nervous. His Adam's apple bobbed and sweat mixed with sand slid down his back. His eyes were fixed on his surroundings, while his ears listened carefully to the surrounding sounds. Rustle, rustle, rustle. Something seemed to be approaching. It came from beneath his feet. The surroundings were silent. Everyone's hearts were trembling. The sound was getting closer. It seemed like the other party had no intention of hiding its tracks. On the sand, a blue carapace peeked out. Everyone held their breaths. Some wanted to run, but after what happened earlier, they hesitated when they lifted their feet. After a moment of struggle, they retracted their feet. Their bodies began to tremble. The giant blue beetle that appeared before Yiken had no other obvious wounds other than scratches on its carapace. It looked fine. However, the thing it was biting on attracted everyone's attention. It was a sword the one Black Sand used to hold. If the sword was here, did that mean Black Sand was dead? Everyone had their own guesses, but they had to admit that those who stayed here were relieved. The blue beetles felt that Black Sand was no longer a threat. The vipers, on the other hand, believed that Black Sand would be no match for Yiken without the sword. Hence, their betrayal didn't need to be wary of Black Sand. Not knowing why the giant beetle appeared here again, Yiken didn't dare to move. He stood there stiffly. He wasn't the one who summoned the beetle. He wasn't sure if the giant beetle would attack him after killing Black Sand. The giant blue beetle bit on the sword and moved towards Yiken. The people gathered around Yiken quickly retreated. Some of the blue beetles stood in front of Yiken. Yiken patted them and gestured for them to move aside, leaving Yiken to face the approaching giant beetle alone. Yiken felt the pressure of facing such a creature alone, but he had no choice but to stand here. He watched the approaching giant beetle and thought of a possibility. His gaze was fixed on the sword in the giant beetle's mouth. His heartbeat quickened uncontrollably and his palms were sweating. The giant beetle bit on the sword and approached Yiken. It leaned in as if trying to discern something. Its paddle-like antennae twitched, giving Yiken the illusion that he would be flattened in the next moment. The others didn't dare to breathe too loudly. After a while, the giant blue beetle loosened its grip, and the sword fell to the sand beside Yiken's feet. After dropping the sword, the giant blue beetle turned and left. Yiken looked at the sword beside his feet. He squatted down and gripped the hilt with trembling hands. There were some scratches on the blade, but they weren't deep. The blade wasn't damaged either. Yiken's palm brushed across the blade, wiping away the sand on it. The blade was still shiny, carrying with it a sense of holiness. The sun was still blazing above his head, but the blade was chilly. It was as warm as the sand underground. Lifting his head to look at the blue beetle that was gradually disappearing into the distance, the sunlight reflected off its back was tinged with a faint blue hue. Yiken's hand on the sword hilt shifted from a grip to a support, while his other hand rested on the sword. Lifting the golden patterned sword with both hands, he knelt on the sand that was heated by the sun and bowed towards the departing blue figure. Seeing this, the other blue beetles knelt down in unison, bowing towards the departing blue figure. At this moment, they seemed to have realized something that they had heard of but never experienced before. It was something called faith. Many of them had ancestors who were slaves. They only heard about the tribe from their ancestors when they were alone. Therefore, they didn't understand the tribesmen's feelings of totem worship. But now they seemed to have touched it. The patterns drawn on their arms, chests, backs and other places seemed to carry a scorching heat that was branded into their hearts. The patterns that used to be laughable had now become sacred, just like how they were now bowing towards the giant blue figure. Perhaps, This bit of faith would be able to support them to survive in the desert. While the blue beetles knelt down in unison, the vipers exchanged glances. Kneel or not? Would they be eaten if they didn't? It was better to kneel. Since they had chosen to join the blue beetles, and their leader had knelt, how could they still stand? If they didn't show their loyalty now, when would they? Hence, after the blue beetles, the vipers who had chosen to side with them knelt down as well. Under the worship of hundreds of people, the giant blue beetle left and disappeared under the sand. The little beetles that lingered nearby also left, burrowing into the sand. Soon they were nowhere to be seen. This time, the insect tide had really retreated. It had completely retreated. When there was not a single beetle to be seen, Yiken stood up with his sword in hand. He stared ahead with a deep gaze, feeling as if he had been reborn. He was beginning to understand what the elders had said. After ordering his subordinates to count those who had chosen to side with them, Yiken walked into the sandstone house. This morning, it was still Black Sand's mansion. Now it had a new owner. However, Yiken didn't think much of this place. He walked towards a stone table. On it was a piece of animal skin that Black Sand had written earlier. On it was written the terms of cooperation. It was a cooperation, but all the terms listed on it treated the blue beetles as slaves. This was also why Yiken didn't agree to it. Before the giant blue beetle appeared, under Black Sand's coercion, the others looked at him and waited for him to make a decision. Perhaps some of them wanted to agree at the last minute and think of a solution after this hurdle. However, Yiken knew that as long as he agreed now, Black Sand would hand over the agreement he had written long ago and return them to their status as slaves. Even if the giant blue beetle hadn't appeared, Yiken wouldn't have agreed. He was even prepared to fight to the death, but he didn't expect. A slight pain came from his palm. Frowning, Yiken wiped the blood on his palm onto the animal skin. Then, he swung his sword and chopped the animal skin into pieces. Walking out of the sandstone house, Yiken lifted his head and looked in a direction. That was where the Sky Waters Desert Robbers' underground palace was located. They had experienced despair and all sorts of hardships. In the future, they would experience even more glorious things. The Desert Robbers' location was going to be a huge storm. Xiaoxian didn't plan to ask about the Desert Robbers' plans. The presence of Desert Robbers would definitely pose a threat to Rock Hill City. Even if the current leader of the Desert Robbers wasn't experienced enough, and their strength hadn't really improved, they would pose a threat to other forces in the desert in the future. It would be best if they could restrain Rock Hill City. As for Sapphire, the sacred relic that Yiken and the others worshipped, it was here because Xiaoxian asked it to. Of course, Xiaoxian wasn't just here for the two desert robber groups. He had Sapphire fight with Black Sand because he wanted Black Sand to be Sapphire's whetstone. After unlocking Sapphire's fourth lock, Xiaoxian didn't know how capable it would be. He needed to test it out in real combat. Besides, Sapphire lived in the desert. The enhancement and physical changes brought about by the fourth lock were all to adapt to the desert environment. It was suitable for survival here, and there were more beetles around it. It couldn't follow Xiaoxian to Yinjiao's headquarters. If Xiaoxian brought Sapphire out of the desert to other places, Sapphire wouldn't be able to unleash its full potential. Therefore, Xiaoxian didn't plan to bring it out of the desert. This was the most suitable place for it. However, there were still people from Rock Hill City in the desert, as well as many scattered bands of desert bandits. Perhaps the bandits had yet to develop, and their leaders hadn't had enough time to improve, but humans were complex and cunning. In order to survive in the desert, Sapphire needed to understand more. Sapphire could learn all of these through its battle with Black Sand. Although Black Sand had broken through his shackles, which meant he had truly taken over the power his former slave master had given him. However, the power in his body wasn't stable enough. He hadn't developed enough as a whole. Just like a tribesman who had just merged with a fire seed, he hadn't fully absorbed the fire seed's power. Currently, Black Sand didn't have the upper hand against Sapphire. This was why Xiaoxian didn't worry about Sapphire testing the waters. However, Black Sand's sword could cause some damage to Sapphire. Although it wasn't as good as Heng's sword, it was still a sword made by the Gongjia family. It could be used as a personal signature sword. It wasn't easy to leave a scratch on Sapphire's back. Xiao Xian wanted Sapphire to know that creatures that looked weaker than it could still fight back. They could even use tricks. Sapphire needed to come up with a countermeasure too. When one's power wasn't absolute, one needed to be smarter. The insect swarm was eye-catching enough. Xiao Xian hoped Sapphire could learn more from this experience. This was his first slave. Xiao Xian didn't want it to become cannon fodder in the desert. Fortunately, Sapphire was smart. When it first created the sand waterfall, it looked like it was defending and attacking, but in reality, it was testing black sand and the sword. The sand in the sand waterfall rubbed against the sword, allowing Sapphire to understand the sword's general condition. It could confirm whether it could withstand the attack with its back armor. Once it confirmed that the sword couldn't really hurt it, it seized the opportunity and black sand could forget about escaping. Searching for food in the desert was never easy. Beasts would cherish every opportunity. Hence, black sand couldn't escape even if he wanted to. As for why the beetles didn't attack Yiken, it was because Sapphire told them not to get close to Yiken. With the beetles' abilities, they couldn't differentiate between too many people and execute overly complicated orders. Hence, it was impossible for Xiao Xian to have them all avoid the blue beetles. Hence, he settled for the next best thing, which was to avoid Yiken. Xiao Xian was interested in the blue beetles, but Sapphire no longer remembered them. Xiao Xian couldn't understand the truth. If Xiao Xian wasn't here, the insect swarm would have attacked indiscriminately. In fact, Yiken would have followed in Black Sand's footsteps. After this incident, Xiao Xian told Sapphire to remember Yiken's scent. If it encountered his men in the future, as long as they didn't attack Sapphire, it wouldn't lead the insect swarm to attack Yiken's men. After all, their totem was the blue dung ball-pushing beetle. Since the blue beetles regarded Sapphire as their religion, it was best to let this misunderstanding continue. Outside Viper's small town, skeletons could be seen occasionally. They belonged to people who failed to escape when the insect swarm appeared. Xiao Xian returned to where Yinjiao's men were waiting. "Are you okay?" Ta and the others hurried over to ask. They heard the commotion in the small town and saw the insect swarm. Ta said that he wouldn't make a move until Xiao Xian gave the signal. As expected, the insect swarm appeared not long after. They didn't dare to step into the area where the insect swarm occurred. They weren't Xiao Xian. They wouldn't be attacked by the insect swarm. Many of the snake tribesmen ran out in all directions. Some ran in this direction, and the flaming horn tribesmen killed them on the spot. Otherwise, they would be exposed. Xiao Xian had the beetles deal with the corpses on the ground. Once they were buried in the sand, there was no trace of them. They couldn't stay here for long. Perhaps the blue beetles would arrive soon to take over the remaining Viper forces. Not many people knew about Xiao Xian's relationship with the insect swarm. At least, the desert robbers didn't know. Perhaps they would find out in the future, but for now, it was best not to tell them. Viper's small town wasn't a good place to rest. It made the 5 captured men nervous. They would rather sleep on the sand than go to the small town. Coincidentally, the Yinjiao people didn't want to be with the desert robbers either. They left and headed out of the desert. Gongjia Ren and the other 5 were on Sapphire's back. After receiving food and water and applying medicine to their wounds, they felt much better after some rest. Elder Xiao Xian, Gongjia Kan, the oldest of the 5, spoke carefully. "What is it?" Xiao Xian looked at Gongjia Kansas, that traitor. Gongjia Kan was referring to the traitor of the Gongjia family. "He's been eaten," said Xiao Xian. He watched as the man was swallowed by the insect swarm. Hearing that the traitor had been eaten by the insects, the 6 Gongjia members heaved a sigh of relief. At least the traitor had been punished. However, they soon sighed. They were all implicated and forced to come out. Who would have thought that the traitor would betray them, and even lead the desert bandits to capture them, only to end up like this? "Why? Do you feel bad?" said Lei. If a Yinjiao member betrayed his own family, he would be hunted down. Even if he escaped far away, we would do everything we could to kill him. Like that person, the one who betrayed his own family and sought refuge with the slave master? "Dao Yu," said Tua. Yes, that's him. Dao Yu. Even though he sought refuge with the slave master and lived well in the desert, didn't he get killed by Xian in the end? When Lei mentioned Dao Yu, Xiao Xian thought of what happened back then. If it was as he guessed, Dao Yu was considered dead but had not disappeared. He was just alive in another state. Somewhere in the desert, a team of 200 people walked on the sand. Unlike the desert robbers, this team's formation was more unique. The most eye-catching was, of course, the giant golden beast walking in the middle. The giant beast was oval-shaped, but not as flat as Sapphire. It was longer, and when it walked, one could see rings of expansion and contraction marks on its back, as if it was made up of several sections. The seemingly heavy back armor armed most of its body, with long legs protruding from its body. There were many legs, supporting the entire body's movements. On the back of this giant beast, there was a metal frame covered with some cloth curtains, blocking Yangguang. It looked like a small house with a person lying on a wide chair. "Have you found the person?" A lazy voice came from inside. A short and fat figure quickly approached the giant beast, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He said respectfully, "Third young master, not yet." Above, the cloth curtains were lifted and a hard fist-sized fruit core was thrown out, mercilessly smashing towards the man's head. A cold voice followed. "Then hurry up and find him." Chapter 747. After receiving the 6 Gongjia members, the Yinjiao people did not stay any longer. They left the desert as quickly as possible. Just because they did not encounter any obstacles before, it did not mean that things would go smoothly later on. Just like before, they spent more time traveling at night and would rest during the day. Sometimes they would sleep less because they were in a hurry. When they were hunting in the forest, the Yinjiao warriors would occasionally stay up all night. They were just not used to the desert environment, so their speed was limited. However, they still had the stamina to travel. On the way back, the Yinjiao people told the Gongjia members about the Yinjiao tribe's living conditions. Gongjia Run and the rest had planned to live in a tribe that hunted all day long, hidden in the depths of the forest. They would live in simple houses made of wood and stone, use metal tools they no longer used, wear old coarse linen clothes, and live with a group of barbaric tribesmen. However, the more they listened, the more they felt that something was amiss. So the Yinjiao people did not live in the depths of the forest? So the Yinjiao people did not only live in simple houses made of wood and stone? So other than hunting, the Yinjiao people also knew how to farm. Their farmlands were not small, and they even reared domesticated animals. So the Yinjiao people had their own trading area, and it was a trading area built like a city. What surprised them even more was the new bronze weapons in the Yinjiao people's hands, and Xiao Xian's knife of unknown material. In terms of hardness, even the best Gongjia Run was not confident that his sword could beat Yinjiao's new bronze weapons. Unbelievable! Were these the tribesmen they had imagined? During their conversation with the Gongjia members, the Yinjiao people noticed that these people's impression of the tribesmen was so backward. This was intolerable. Although their tribe used to be like that, Yinjiao had changed drastically. The Yinjiao people were very angry at Gongjia Ren and the rest's opinion of the Yinjiao people. The 6 people were already stunned by the scene described by the Yinjiao people. When they saw that the expressions of the Yinjiao people weren't very good, they knew that they must have offended these people, and hurriedly explained, "I'm sorry, we've been staying in the royal city for a long time, so we don't know much about tribesmen's lives." Gongjia Run was embarrassed too. The tribesmen he had heard about were really like that. On the other side of the sea, other than the slave masters and nobles who built cities, there were also various organizations and groups that no longer lived as tribes. The 6 Gongjia members were familiar with these, but for the tribesmen who lived in the depths of the forest, far away from cities, and maintained a primitive tribal state, what they heard from others was vastly different from what the Yinjiao people described. Perhaps it was just as Hung had said. Yinjiao was a good place. Things there might not be as bad as before. They had always thought that the tribesmen were lacking in metal weapons. Perhaps there would be a shortage of resources when the time came. However, according to Ta, they had hoarded a lot of metal weapons, and even robbed a lot of them. Although they didn't have much resources, It was enough for them to fight. Since they knew that the tribe they were going to rely on was not bad. The most important thing was that they would have the opportunity to showcase their talents and have their own forge. That would be enough. The 6 Gongjia members were looking forward to the new life they were about to live. Their mood improved, and they started to talk more with the Yinjiao people. The most important thing for you to live here is to master the language here. Not every tribe knows the language there, said Xiaoxian. The Yinjiao people knew the language on the other side of the sea, and could converse with the 6 Gongjia members, because Zheng Luo and the other half of the tribe had influenced each other. Moreover, the people Xiaoxian brought along this time also knew some of the language, so they wouldn't be unable to understand the Gongjia members' cries for help. However, once they left the desert and entered the tribesmen's territory, they would have to do as the Romans do. Indeed, Gongjiaran nodded. They had to learn this language. Since they had nothing to do during the journey, the 6 Gongjia members followed the Yinjiao people to learn the language and writing used by the tribesmen. Sometimes they would even write on the sand when they rested. The medicine the Yinjiao people gave them was of better quality. Now the 6 Gongjia members could walk and jog. However, they had not fully recovered and could not keep up with the Yinjiao people's speed. That was why they were still on Sapphire's back. We'll be out of the desert in about 5 to 6 days, said Ta. 5 to 6 days was not a long time. Gongjia Ren and the rest had spent much longer in the desert, and it was much more difficult. Compared to before, it was much easier now. 5 to 6 days was nothing. Be careful, said Xiaoxian suddenly. Ta and the rest who were drinking water were stunned. We'll run into trouble? Xiaoxian crushed the straw rope in his hand and threw it into the sand. He mixed it with his foot. At first glance, it was difficult to separate the straw shreds from the dry sand. We can't avoid it? Asked Ta. It'll be difficult. They might have followed us here. Xiaoxian thought of the Bailuo he met before. He knew that slave masters who had lived in the desert for thousands of years must have many beasts that were good at tracking. They might even have other methods. It would not be easy to shake them off. After hearing Xiaoxian's words, the rest became serious. Rock Hill City, asked Tua. It should be them. Anyway, everyone be careful. Gongjia Ren and the rest were puzzled as to why Xiaoxian could predict what would happen. However, seeing how trusting the Yinjiao people were, and how serious the atmosphere in the group was, they did not dare to ask questions. After all, it was for their sake. After that, the group became much quieter. The 6 Gongjiaran members stopped asking questions, because the flaming horns were too focused on guarding their surroundings. They had no time to chat with them. I heard that Rock Hill City created some monsters that can't be killed. Have you guys seen them? Asked Lei. Gongjiaran shook his head. We've only seen them once from afar. I don't know if they really can't be killed, but after being cut in half, their upper bodies could still move nimbly. They didn't bleed, and their bodies were black. When they crossed the sea, there was a chaotic battle there. They took a detour and took a boat. They had only seen them once from afar, and it was a very strange scene. The Gongjia members felt chills run down their spines. It was no wonder Royal City had received news that the battle was not going well. Anyone would be afraid of those monsters. When the Flaming Horn tribesmen heard that these monsters would not die even after being cut in half, and that they could even use their arms to move around, as if they could not feel any pain, even if the Flaming Horn tribesmen were mentally prepared, they still felt a layer of goosebumps on their arms. Not even cutting off their heads? Asked Tua. I don't know. Gongjiaran and the rest really did not know. They had used all their means to avoid the battlefield and their pursuers. They did not pay much attention to the monsters at the time. They did not even have time to run for their lives, let alone observe if the monsters could still move after their heads were cut off. They can, said Xiaoxian. The Yinjiao members and the Gongjia members all looked at Xiaoxian. Other than Ta, who knew part of the reason, the rest did not know. Those monsters have no internal organs, including their hearts. Their heads are not the core of their bodies. Of course, cutting off their heads will definitely affect them, but they can still move. Xiaoxian continued. That's why if you encounter them, you can first cut off their heads, then their limbs. However, They will not die, so you must be careful. There might be a sneak attack with a severed arm or something. Everyone felt their hair stand on end at Xiaoxian's words. Gong Jiaran even touched his neck unconsciously. When he heard Xiaoxian say cut off their limbs, he touched his arm again. He felt his hair stand on end. After all, they grew up in a different environment from the Yinjiao people. These words were more impactful to them. Although the Yinjiao members were horrified, they still remembered Xiaoxian's words. Remember, they are just puppets. They are controlled by someone. They have no life, they cannot bleed, they do not feel pain, and they do not have self-awareness. Other than their strong bodies, they are no different from withered wood. The key lies in the person controlling them. If there is a chance, I will kill the person controlling the puppets first, continued Xiaoxian. The Yinjiao members nodded, indicating that they remembered. Since those puppets could not be considered human, and were no different from wood, they would treat these dead humans the same way they treated wood. Under everyone's vigilance, they walked for another 2 days. On this day, Xiaoxian heard the cry of an eagle in the distance. It was the cry of a cha-cha. They're here. Xiaoxian looked in a direction. They're fast. Soon, Ta sensed someone approaching at a speed much faster than their speed. It was no wonder Xiaoxian said they might not be able to avoid it. The Yinjiao members were on high alert. In the distance, where the sand met the sky, dust began to roll. A giant figure reflected the golden light, the most eye-catching of all. It was a giant oval-shaped beast. From the reflection of the light, one could tell that its entire body was covered in hard armor. There were people on the back of the giant beast, but they were blocked by a cloth curtain, so one could not see who was inside. There were other people around the giant golden beast, all wearing golden armor. They were very similar to the Jinjiao guards Xiaoxian had seen before. Xiaoxian's gaze swept over the people closest to the giant beast. Although they were all wearing armor, and gave Xiaoxian a similar feeling to the Jinjiao guards, Xiaoxian was more concerned about the people running on the periphery. Those people were wearing thick cotton clothes and looked very low-key. Even their heads were covered. If they were ordinary people, they would definitely be sweating from wearing such clothes and running so vigorously under such a hot sun. The people wearing golden armor around the giant beast were relatively normal. One could see that they were tired, but these people didn't seem to feel it at all. They didn't seem to be tired at all. It was them. They were the legendary freaks. Only those who no longer had self-awareness, knew no pain, knew no fatigue, and knew no cold or heat could move like a machine. Even the movement of their feet was neat and tidy. If that was all, they would look more like well-trained soldiers. In reality, they were just puppets. Now that they were close, the sand and dust had limited cover. A gust of wind could be seen. There were about 200 people. Among these 200 people, there were 100 people in armor, and close to 100 freaks. They were split evenly between the two sides. Seeing that there was a giant beast, the 6 Gongjia members dismounted from Sapphire's back. Sapphire was obviously going to participate in the battle, and could not carry them all the time. Moreover, they could walk and run now. They held the new bronze weapons given by the Yinjiao people, and stood together. The Yinjiao people surrounded them in the middle. The troop was getting closer and closer, only slowing down when they were 100 meters away. They walked forward a little more before stopping. The people of the Flaming Horn tribe noticed that the 100 people closest to the giant beast could clearly hear the sound of their breathing after they stopped. Even though they were wearing armor, they could see the rise and fall of their chests. Even the giant beast seemed to be panting. When it lowered its head, the sand on the ground was blown up. However, the people standing at the periphery were not even breathing, let alone panting. After they stopped, they stood there stiffly like they were made of wood. Due to the thick linen cloth, their faces could not be seen clearly. However, the Yinjiao people had already guessed that these people were the freaks everyone was talking about. When Sapphire saw the giant beast, it walked to Xiaoxian's side and raised its 2 long forelimbs, looking at the giant beast threateningly. It was difficult for giant beasts to get along with each other. Hand over the Gongjia people. A cold voice came from the back of the giant golden armored beast. They could not see the person's face through the cloth, but they could hear the thick arrogance and disdain in the voice. Without waiting for an answer, the person continued. Which one of you is Gong Jiaren? Step forward. Xiao Xian raised an eyebrow. Ta and the rest's expressions changed too. Why did the person only call out Gong Jiaren's name? However, they did not look at Gong Jiaren. Xiao Xian waved his hand behind his back, indicating that they did not need to answer. The person waited for a while, but did not receive a reply. His voice lowered again, this time with an obvious threat. Which one is Gong Jiaren? If you don't answer, you'll all die. Xiao Xian thought carefully about the voice. It sounded familiar, but it had been too long since they last met. And who are you? Asked Xiao Xian. Shut up. You haven't answered the young master's question. An armored man took 2 steps forward, pointing at Xiao Xian as he shouted. Then, a slightly gloomy voice came from behind the cloth on the insect's back. Second young master, don't waste time. Kill a few people first and they'll talk. You're right. It was the same voice from before, but it did not have the arrogance it had when facing Xiao Xian and the rest. It seemed to be afraid of the person who spoke. Second young master? Luoya City's second young master, Su Le? Xiao Xian suddenly remembered this person. When they first entered the desert, they were in Luoya City. Luoya City's king, Su Luan, had 3 sons. The first young master, Su Ka, second young master, Su Lo, and third young master, Su Gu. They were half-brothers, but their relationship was like fire and water. Back then, it was because of Xiao Xian that Su Gu snatched the spot that should have been Su Li's to go to Beast City. As soon as Xiao Xian spoke, the man on the golden beast's back lifted the cloth curtain and looked down. Then his eyes turned sharp and cold. Yinjiao Xiao Xian? Every word was squeezed out from the gaps between his teeth. Even Gong Jiaran and the rest could feel the intense hatred. The rest of Yinjiao looked at Xiao Xian, asking with their eyes, does this person have a grudge against you? Even Xiao Xian did not expect Su Le to remember him. It had been so long, but he still remembered him so clearly. Of course, Su Le remembered it clearly. If it weren't for Xiao Xian, Su Gu wouldn't have had the opportunity to follow his father to the Beast City. He wouldn't have been qualified to participate in some important affairs. And he wouldn't have had the opportunity to develop to the point where he could compete with him today. Su Le was a vengeful person. Even if it had been a long time, he would still remember those who had offended him. Of course, he remembered Xiao Xian. While Su Le and Xiao Xian were confronting each other, somewhere further away, a team similar to Su Li's was also advancing. Even the giant beast was of the same species. A short and fat person trembled and ran to the side of the golden beast. He said to the man on the beast's back, "Third young master, there's news." "Oh, hurry up and tell me. Did the other team find him first?" The man lying on the beast's back casually picked up a fruit and took a big bite, as if venting his anger. The other team had taken the lead again. He could tell that Su Gu was not in a good mood. The short and fat person braced himself and said, "Yes, second young master has found them. However, there are people protecting them. I think they're from the Yinjiao tribe. This is strange. Why would the Yinjiao tribe come here?" Puffed. Su Gu spat out the fruit he had just bitten and tossed half of the crispy fruit away. He shouted, "Come up here and talk." The short and fat man was shocked, but he reacted quickly and climbed onto the beast's back. He looked clumsy, but his movements were agile. He leaped onto the beast's back and came before the curtain. He bowed and said, "We've just received news that the Yinjiao tribe took the Gongjia family members away. Second young master is now fighting for them. Third young master, do you think we should hurry over? If we're too slow, the Gongjia family members will be taken away." The short and fat man waited for Su Gu's reply. He thought it was strange and asked again, "Young master, you?" "I'm not going." A voice came from inside. "Yes, immediately. What?" The short and fat man thought he had heard wrongly. Didn't the third young master and the second young master fight fiercely? They had to fight for everything. After all, the lord of Luoya City, Su Luan, had said that only one person could inherit his things. Now, among Su Luan's living children, only the second young master, Su Lo, and the third young master, Su Gu, were left. In the past, Everyone thought it would be the eldest young master, Su Ka, and the second young master, Su Le, who would fight for the right to be the Lord of Luoya City. However, after the desert incident, the Lord of Luoya City was no longer called the Lord of Luoya City. Even so, the current Luoya City was at least twice as big as before. As for the title of Lord, it didn't matter much since they couldn't surpass Rock Hill City. The city was twice as big, with more resources and wealth. They could even be entrusted with important tasks by the Rock Hill City King. This was a huge temptation. Su Luan's decision still didn't change. He said that there would only be one heir, and almost all the resources and wealth. Therefore, at that time, many people thought it would be a fight between the eldest young master and the second young master. However, they didn't expect that the eldest young master would encounter an accident during a mission and be killed by people from the other side of the sea. Only the second and third young masters were left. At that time, many people still thought that since the eldest young master was gone, then the second young master would definitely inherit the throne. However, the third young master, Su Gu, rose to power. Now, the two young masters were almost evenly matched. Everything was fiercely fought. If it was in the past, after receiving a mission, once he heard that Su Le would arrive first, Su Gu would definitely be anxious and urge him to hurry. However, this time it was different. I said I'm not going, and I'm not going. Didn't you hear me? After a pause, Su Gu said again, slow down. There's no need to rush. Yes. The short and fat man wiped the sweat from his forehead, thinking that the third young master was really hard to please. Just now he said he wouldn't go, and the next thing he said was to slow down. Would he regret it after a while? No matter what, the team had already slowed down according to Su Gu's request. The originally hurried team now looked like they were taking a stroll, lazy and leisurely. Why are they from the Yinjiao tribe? Su Gu was troubled. If the Yinjiao people came, then the leader was most likely Xiao Xian. To be honest, Su Gu was a little afraid of Xiao Xian. This was something he felt from the beginning in Luoya City. Later on, some things made him even more afraid of Xiao Xian. However, he wasn't willing to give up just like that. That was why he asked the team to slow down. It would be best if the Yinjiao people and Su Li's people were both injured when they arrived. That would save him a lot of trouble. Chapter 748. Under the scorching sun, two groups of people stood facing each other amidst the endless yellow sands. Su Le glared at Xiao Xian with a murderous glint in his eyes. If possible, he wanted to personally chop Xiao Xian up and feed him to the slaves. However, Su Le cherished his life. He knew that Xiao Xian was not easy to deal with. Although he hadn't seen it with his own eyes back then, he had heard of the situation in the Colosseum. Su Le didn't want to take the risk. If he died, the right to inherit Autumnfall would only go to that idiot Su Gu. However, with Su Li's current status, he didn't need to go personally. He was a slave master, and had slaves under his command. Ever since the situation in the desert changed, he had also trained some of his better slaves. He only needed to leave the fighting to the slaves while he watched from the sidelines. Not to mention, Su Le tilted his head slightly to look at a person seated diagonally behind him. This person was dressed in the same way as the silent people outside the group. They were all dressed in grayish-white sackcloth. The only difference was that while the silent people had their heads wrapped in sackcloth, this person only had his head covered by a hood. Only the lower half of his pale face could be seen. When the light was dim, not even a hint of his expression could be seen. In the desert, most people's skin was tanned due to the sun. However, this person looked like he had not seen Yangguang for a long time. He even gave off a sickly pale feeling. There was more than one person like this in Rock Hill City. Some participated in the Coastal War, while others followed the slave masters. His third brother also had such a person beside him. These people were the ones who controlled the monsters on the outskirts. Although having such people around made him uncomfortable, on the other hand, they were also a protective force. With these people around, Su Le felt a lot more at ease. The slaves under his command were also slowly being depleted. Glancing at the people behind him, Su Le felt more confident. He had 100 slaves on his side, and 100 monsters on his side. Looking at Yinjiao's side, he counted no more than 50. Comparing the beasts, his beasts were obviously bigger than Xiaoxian's. Moreover, the beetle did not seem to be very powerful. With this comparison, Su Li's confidence increased once again. Hence, Su Li's eyes flashed with viciousness. If it had been anyone else, he might have let them go after they handed over the Gongjia family members. After all, the battle was exhausting, and he could not bear to part with his subordinates. Training these slaves was not easy, but Yinjiao people? He would not leave a single one of them alive. He could even bring the Yinjiao corpses back to claim his reward. Sulu pulled on a metal bell beside him. Immediately a slave came over. 8 armored slaves unloaded the hut from the back of the giant beast and carried it steadily like a palanquin. They were afraid that their hands would accidentally shake and make the people inside angry. Looking at their practiced movements, they must have done it many times. Be careful, it's coming, Xiaoxian warned. The hut that was removed from the giant beast's body was only to allow the giant beast to participate in the battle without affecting the people inside. Su Li sat inside and was carried to the back of the group. The golden-armored people surrounded him, while the silent people stood at the front and the outermost circle. Without any worries, the giant golden beast's pants-like teeth moved and let out a howl like a gust of wind. It lifted its upper body and bent its dozens of legs downwards, exposing its abdomen that was almost touching the ground. Although its abdomen was not as heavily armored as its sides and back, it was still hard armor, albeit lighter in color. Then, the golden-armored beast smashed its upper body into the ground like a spiked club. The sandy ground shook violently as if a boulder had fallen or a mountain had collapsed. It was as if a sudden clap of thunder rang in their ears. Those who were close by felt their heads hurt and their chests churn. The 6 Gongjia members felt a sense of oppression. When they were escaping, they had never encountered a giant beast like this. Even if they had only seen it from afar. If they had encountered a giant beast like this, they would have died long ago. After the rumble, waves of sand rose and spread towards the Yinjiao people. The waves spread to the feet of the Yinjiao people. Even those who stood 100 meters away felt their footing become unstable. It was as if they were standing on a small boat in the middle of a storm, swaying and swaying. The giant golden figure stirred up a gust of sand that rubbed against the giant golden beast's armor. It was as if sand was being polished against hard metal, producing a sharp sizzling sound. Gongjia Ren lifted his sleeves to cover his nose and mouth, squinting his eyes into thin slits to prevent the sand from entering his eyes. His slightly wide sleeves flapped under the wind and sand, and his hair was almost blown parallel to the ground. This giant beast was not easy to deal with. Then what should the Yinjiao people do? Gongjia Ren looked around. To Gongjia Ren's surprise, the Yinjiao people did not show any signs of fear or nervousness. It was as if the giant golden beast's performance was nothing more than a normal gust of wind. In reality, that was indeed the case. They were not pretending to be calm. The Yinjiao people really did not think much of the giant golden beast. What's with the pretense? We've even seen the king stoneworm. This giant beast may give Gongjia Ren and the rest a lot of pressure. However, to the Yinjiao people who were used to giant beasts, hunting fearsome beasts, and even a few king beasts, they were not affected much. The Yinjiao people only turned to glance at the giant golden beast, then turned their attention back to the masked and silent people. They were more concerned about these so-called monsters. However, the Yinjiao people's silence made Sulu think they were afraid. That's all you have. Forget it. Hand over Gongjia Ren and the rest, and I'll give you time to leave, said Sulu slowly, as if this was a rare gift. He gave them time to leave, but did not say how much time they would be given, nor did he mention how he would hunt them down. At this, Xiaoxian smiled and looked in the direction of the wind. You think you have an advantage in numbers? You want to bully us with numbers? So what if I do? Sulu thought it was normal to bully others with numbers. It was also the safest and he liked it the most. It would be abnormal if it was the other way around. Nothing. Xiaoxian raised his right forefoot and stomped down. The ground beneath his feet trembled slightly. It was not as strong as the giant golden beast, but it traveled far. The air around them seemed to change slightly with this stomp, as if muffled thunder was coming from under Xiao Xian's feet. The sound was not loud, as if it came from afar, but also from underground. A layer of sand on the ground spread outwards in a circle, expanding rapidly. Soon, it had passed by Su Li's side. The armored men standing around Su Lu felt a gentle gust of wind graze their feet. However, they had the illusion that a cold hand had gripped their feet, sending chills down their spines. The weather was hot, and they had been traveling for a long time, so it should have been very hot. However, they couldn't help but shiver with an ominous premonition. "Young master, something's wrong." Su Lu found it strange too. He pulled the cloth aside and looked outside. Suddenly he shuddered. Beetles. He saw small black beetles appearing on the sand. One by one, they looked like they could be stomped to death. However, more and more beetles appeared. This gave him an ominous feeling. He then looked at the giant blue beetle beside Xiao Xian. Su Lu took a deep breath. His fingers trembled and he released the cloth. He swallowed his saliva. His voice was filled with suppressed shock. Insect tide. When did the horrors of the insect tide become known to everyone? When did it spread? In Su Li's memories, even though there were cases of beetles chewing on the corpses of battle beasts in the early days, that wasn't the start of their panic. The true terror that the insect swarm brought upon them started from an incident in the past. Back then, the Snowfield King sent 200 golden armored guards to hunt down Xiao Xian. However, not a single one of them returned. It was said that those who went out to search for the golden armored guards found the skeletons of the golden armored guards somewhere in the desert. All that was left were pale white bones, tattered clothes, and the golden armor that they were so proud of. They were half buried in the sand, filled with the aura of death. Even if one didn't see it with their own eyes, they could imagine such a strange scene just by hearing it from others. Although the rumor was exaggerated, the 200 golden armored guards might not have all died under the insect tide. However, the complete disappearance of the 200 golden armored guards was most likely related to the insect tide. It was also from then on that the insect tide became another disaster in the desert that caused everyone's expression to change. The slaves under Su Li's command were indeed armed according to the famous golden armor guards of Snowfield City. He and Su Gu had done the same thing. The armors on these slaves were also made in the same batch, and Su Luan had distributed them later. It was a fair distribution of resources before the Lord of Luoya City chose his successor. Back then, the golden armored guards of Snowfield City, who were as cruel and bloody as a meat grinder, couldn't escape the insect tide. What would happen to his slaves? Su Lu was indeed proud of having a team of slaves armed with golden armor. However, he also knew that there was still a gap between his slaves and the golden armored guards of Snowfield City. As he thought about it, Su Lu felt a chill run down his spine. His teeth chattered. So this was what Xiao Xian meant when he said bully with numbers. The black insects that rushed out from under the sand had formed a tide of insects. As far as the eye could see, the black tide of insects almost blocked most of the view. The black beetles swarmed towards Su Lu like a tidal wave. The armored slaves screamed and slapped away the beetles that pounced on them. However, more and more beetles squeezed through the gaps between their armor and their clothes. The beasts that the slaves rode stomped their hooves in horror, flinging the people off their backs. The originally neat formation became a mess. However, there were exceptions. Xiao Xian looked at the situation with a solemn expression. They're avoiding the monsters. Those beetles, whether it was fresh or rotten meat, would not leave anything behind. However, when faced with the monsters, it was as if they didn't want to get close to them. They were very repulsive, and even took a detour when they rushed past them. Compared to the panicked golden armored slaves, the people who were covered in linen standing on the periphery were like wooden blocks. They didn't react to their surroundings at all. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.